Ever since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022, the war has been marked by a brutal stalemate. Russia floods Ukraine with soldiers and equipment, while Ukraine valiantly defends its territory, occasionally launching counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. For nearly 30 months, this grinding conflict has followed a predictable pattern, largely because Ukraine was restricted from using Western-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia, a move that could have escalated tensions in Europe to a dangerous level. That's all changed. In a dramatic shift, US President Joe Biden, backed by other NATO allies like the UK, has given Ukraine the green light to strike back directly on Russian soil. This bold decision shatters the so-called red line that had held Ukraine back, and it's setting the stage for a turning point in the war. Ukrainian forces have crossed into Russia, targeting the strategic region of Kursk. This marks the first time since the war began that Ukrainian troops have moved beyond their own borders. So what does this mean for Putin? Why Kursk? And most crucially, what could this development mean for the future of the Ukraine war? Let's dive into these questions, starting with the most pressing one. What on earth is happening in Kursk? On August 6, 2024, Ukraine broke through the thin Russian line of defenses separating Ukraine from Kursk, allowing its soldiers to enter Russian territory for the first time. This breakthrough went underreported on the day that it happened, possibly because media outlets were taking a wait-and-see approach under the assumption that Russia would quickly push the Ukrainian forces back. That isn't what happened. A day later, The Guardian was among the first to properly report on the incursion, noting that the fighting in Kursk had entered its second day, with reports suggesting that Ukraine's forces had managed to advance up to 9 miles away from the border and deeper into the Kursk Oblast. That incursion had been made possible by a highway running north of Sverdlikovo, a Russian border village that also happens to be close to a key natural gas transmission hub. While those reports were unconfirmed at the time, The Guardian pointed out that both official and unofficial Russian sources were claiming that the incursion had happened and that it appeared to involve several hundred Ukrainian soldiers who had taken advantage of the fact that the border between their country and Kursk is one of the most lightly guarded, from the Russian perspective, on the entire front line. Russia was quick to claim that it had already neutralized the incursion. Its defense ministry claimed the incursion was neutralized on the day that it happened, only to backpedal by the time The Guardian released its report to claim that it was ongoing as of lunchtime on August 7th. Russia also provided details on what it had done to counter the offensive. It says using missile strikes and artillery, it destroyed 50 armored vehicles and inflicted 260 casualties on the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine remained tight-lipped about the entire operation. On August 8th, several other media outlets picked up on the story. These included Le Monde, a French news website, which claimed that Ukraine had actually sent 1,000 troops into Kursk, rather than the previously reported several hundred. It also reported more details on what Ukraine did once it crossed the Russian border. Backed by more than 2,000 soldiers that stayed on the Ukrainian side, defending their position and perhaps preparing to follow the initial 1,000 into Kursk, Ukraine crossed the border with 10 tanks and 20 armored vehicles. That immediately casts aspersions on Russia's claims to have destroyed 50 armored vehicles, showcasing just how difficult it is to ascertain full details of what's happened so far. Once Ukraine crossed the border, Russia declared a state of emergency in Kursk as soldiers advanced on several localities, including a small town named Sudza. These localities were bombarded with Ukrainian missiles and drones, reportedly causing at least 5 deaths and over 30 injuries. Furthermore, the August 6th incursion had resulted in fighting breaking out in Oleshnya and Goncharivka, both in the Kursk Oblast, with Russian soldiers in the latter region supposedly being surrounded and captured by Ukrainian forces. The next day saw Ukraine advance further, according to Le Monde, resulting in the capture of around 20 poorly defended Russian villages, including Gornal, Daryuno, and the previously mentioned Sverdlikovo. Those captures also led to Ukraine taking control of the Sudza gas station, a gas transfer point overseen by Russian energy giant Gazprom that represents one of the few entry points for Russian gas into the Ukrainian gas transmission system. This station matters because it's key to Russia being able to transport gas into Europe, meaning the taking of the station will put a small dent into Russia's profitable energy market. NPR also published a report on August 8th detailing the incursion. It backed Le Monde's claims of 1,000 Ukrainians entering Kursk, noting that the number comes from General Valery Gerasimov, who is Russia's chief of general staff. It also noted that it was the first such offensive carried out by Ukraine. Though it had previously backed small groups of Russian exiles as they carried out limited cross-border raids, the incursion into Kursk was the first time that Ukrainian soldiers had entered Russia since the war began. Putin was left with egg on his face. After spending so much of the war trying to portray Russia as an indomitable power to which Ukraine would crumble over time, he now finds himself having to explain why he's allowed Ukraine to take Russian territory. to rub salt into his wounds, the incursion is far from over. At the time of writing, Al Jazeera is running a live tracker covering the Ukraine war, which says the Ukrainian soldiers are still fighting Russians in Kursk. That tracker also contains a quote from Mikhailo Podolyak, a Ukrainian presidential aide, who pins the blame for the incursion on Russia. The root cause of any escalation, shelling, military actions, forced evacuations, and destruction of normal life forms, including within the Russian Federation's own territories like Kursk and the Belgorod regions, is solely Russia's unequivocal aggression, he wrote in a social media post. Al Jazeera also offers a different number for the tanks that have crossed the border, 24 instead of 10. So the details are still blurry. What we can say for sure is that Ukraine is in Kursk and that it's taken up to 1,000 soldiers over the border into Russia. Those soldiers are accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles, in addition to seemingly having access to missiles and drones. They've used these weapons well. Up to 20 small Russian villages are apparently under Ukraine's control, however temporarily that control might last, along with a key Russian gas station. All of this brings us to another key question. Why did Ukraine choose Kursk? That's a question that the White House has been asking. On the evening of August 7th, the US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, published an update on the incursion. It confirmed that US intelligence indicates that Ukraine has penetrated at least 2 of Russia's defensive lines on its sojourn into Kursk, as well as taking a stronghold. It also cited both satellite imagery and geolocation footage to apparently confirm the reports that Ukraine has taken dozens of captives and that it now controls the Sudza gas distribution station. These early reports have prompted the White House to contact Ukraine's leadership to quiz them on the objectives of the incursion. Speaking on August 7th, Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, noted, "We're going to reach out to the Ukrainian military to learn more about their objectives." She also pointed out that the White House supports what she calls common sense actions to stop Russia's attacks. Perhaps the use of the term common sense is a subtle indicator of what the US thinks about the incursion. After all, there appears to be little immediate military value to taking the territory within the Kursk Oblast outside of taking the previously mentioned gas distribution station. And even then, the value is minor. That station sends gas into Ukraine and has likely seen minimal use since the war started. Digging deeper into Kursk itself further demonstrates how it appears to hold minimal strategic value. Though the oblast covers 11,582 square miles, it only contains 1.061 million people, meaning it's far from one of Russia's major population centers. You could argue that its hilly surface and multiple ravines could provide some tactical advantage to Ukraine, assuming it wishes to use Kursk as the launching point for further incursions into Russia, but that seems unlikely. A force of 1,000 isn't what a country sends when it intends to take over an entire oblast. Kursk is a center for agriculture, with farms covering around 77% of its territory and mostly growing sugar beets and wheat, with some fodder crops thrown in for good measure. But again, that's nowhere near enough value to justify an incursion through which Ukraine intends to permanently hold the territory it's captured. Which brings us back to the question, what is Ukraine's goal as it moves deeper into Kursk? The answers don't necessarily have to do with Kursk itself, with the oblast simply being the most convenient available to allow Ukraine to achieve its objectives. Rather, as the BBC explains, the goal may be an entirely different piece of territory, Donetsk. Donetsk, which is part of the wider Donbass region, has been a key target for Russia ever since Putin's special military operation started, and symbolically the Donetsk region is somewhat tied to Russia. A large portion of its people are ethnically Russian and speak Russian as their primary language. Granted, those ethnic Russians don't make up the majority of Donetsk's population, unlike what we saw in Crimea in 2014 and beyond, but there's certainly a Russian influence in the region. After all, as DW points out, it was in Donetsk and the surrounding regions that opposition to Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the Maidan protests of 2013 and 14 were strongest. The Donbass itself has been no stranger to war even before Putin invaded Ukraine. 2014 saw pro-Russian separatists proclaim both Donetsk and Luhansk as people's republics independent of Ukraine, likely with the goal of integrating them into Russia. The point here is that Donetsk offers symbolic importance to Russia. With that symbolic importance comes a continued push to take the region since the beginning of the war. That's why Russia has committed so many soldiers to Donetsk. Tens of thousands of Russian troops have been poured into the region, with Russia also focusing on developing a nearly impenetrable front line through which it pushes against increasingly weakening Ukrainian resistance. Glide bombs pepper Donetsk daily, with the taking of Donetsk setting the stage for Russia's later successes in overtaking the fortress towns of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. In short, Russia is dedicating a ton of its resources to Donbass and Donetsk in particular, which makes what's happening in Donetsk all the more interesting since Ukraine entered Kursk. Speaking to the BBC, a military analyst named Mikhailo SKYROCKET points out that Russia has been forced to redeploy some of the soldiers it had stationed in Donetsk following the Kursk invasion. If you look at the official reports, he claims, there were significantly fewer Russian glide bombs dropped in the Donetsk area. That means the aircraft which carry them are now elsewhere in Russia. Elsewhere is likely Kursk. Ukraine's Kursk incursion has been a success in terms of pulling Russian forces away from a region in which they were previously focused. That may have been the goal all along. Throughout the course of the Ukraine war, Russia has succeeded in focusing the brunt of the fighting in areas in which it wants to take. That's logical, as the invading force, Russia essentially forces Ukraine to react by sending troops to whichever areas on which it focuses. This natural ebb and flow of the war has resulted in Russia leaving scant defenses across some areas of the front line it shares with Ukraine. The northeastern borders, which Ukraine crossed to enter Kursk, were some of the most minimally defended of all. So what we're likely seeing with the Kursk incursion is Ukraine forcing Russia to divert troops away from regions that Russia considers a priority. In creating those diversions, Ukraine weakens the Russian front lines in Donetsk, perhaps opening the door for counterattacks against Russia's offensives. If nothing else, the diversions offer a reprieve to Ukrainian soldiers near Donetsk, who are being bombarded by Russia's glide bombs, giving them time to regroup and reorganize their defenses. Ukraine is essentially keeping Russia honest. It's forcing Putin to realize that he can't be complacent when it comes to taking on Ukraine. Any weakness he displays, such as not reinforcing the front lines near Kursk, can be exploited by Ukraine and used against him. That brings us to a secondary reason why Ukraine may have moved into Kursk. Ukraine is showing that it, along with many of its supporters, is unafraid of crossing a red line. We touched on this earlier when we talked about how several Western nations are allowing Ukraine to use their weapons to attack Russia in its own territory. Perhaps the Kursk incursion is an extension of that. Ukraine will not only fire missiles behind the front lines, but it will actively take Russian territory to show Putin that it's just as capable of invading and fighting within Russia as Russia is of invading Ukraine. Interestingly, Ukraine may even have a modicum of support from the US with this incursion. Though the US is still seeking answers from Ukraine, as we mentioned earlier, the White House also pointed out that the restrictions the US has in place for the use of its weapons in Russia's territory haven't changed. Tellingly, White House spokesman John Kirby went on to say that the Kursk incursion was not a violation of our policy. So the US is looking for common-sense answers, but Ukraine's actions are very unlikely to cause any tensions between it and its most powerful Western ally. So we have two potential reasons for the Kursk incursion so far. Ukraine has used it to stretch Russia's forces along the front lines, potentially relieving pressure in Donetsk. And also it may be using the incursion to showcase just how far it and its Western allies are now willing to step over the red lines that previously prevented Ukraine from doing anything but defend itself against Putin's special military operation. But there's another reason why Ukraine may have chosen now to take territory in Kursk: negotiations. In May 2024, reports started surfacing about Putin being ready to end the Ukraine war through a negotiated ceasefire that would recognize the front lines at the time. From that ceasefire, Russia would enter deeper negotiations that would likely see it try to claim the Ukrainian territory it controlled at the time. That would have seen it essentially take much of the Donbass, including Luhansk and Donetsk, as well as southern regions such as Mariupol. In other words, Russia had a powerful negotiating position. No matter how faltering its invasion of Ukraine may have been, it had still successfully taken territory and was now ready to end the war, claiming that territory permanently. Reuters noted that several sources inside the Kremlin believe Putin was ready to push for these negotiations. One of the 5 it spoke to claimed, "Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire, to freeze the war." Putin himself had practically said as much during a May press conference he held in Belarus, in which he said, "Let them resume," when talking about the possibility of negotiations opening. However, that resumption could only happen if the negotiations were based on the realities on the ground. Ukraine would have to cede territory for Russia to stop. And worst of all, Ukraine had no leverage that it could bring to the negotiating table. With the taking of around 20 villages and a key gas distribution system in Kursk, Ukraine now has leverage. It's possible that Ukraine has taken this territory intending to hold it for the long term. If that's the case, we'll see more troops funneling into Kursk in the coming days. Remember that Ukraine sent an extra 2,000 to support the 1,000 who entered, and more territory taken. Should Russia and Ukraine enter negotiations while Ukraine still controls this territory, it finally has some leverage to bring to ceasefire talk. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky could tell Putin that he would be willing to trade the territory in Kursk for some of the Ukrainian territory Russia has taken. Whether that approach would work, or if Russia would be willing to enter negotiations when Ukraine controls some of its territory, remains to be seen. Which brings us to the final big question we'll ask in this video: what comes next? Russia's response, for one thing. In the immediate aftermath of the Kursk invasion, the oblast's regional governor, Alexei Smirnov, declared a state of emergency. He claimed the move was necessary to eliminate the consequences of enemy forces coming into the region. Air alerts were issued over Kursk, with Russia scrambling fighter jets, which the BBC says were filmed flying low to the ground over the region on the hunt for Ukrainian soldiers. This footage lends credence to Mikhailo Zhrokov's claims that Russia was diverting fighter jets from the Donetsk region to handle its Kursk crisis. Meanwhile, Ukrainian politicians have found themselves just as curious about the reasons behind the incursion as everybody else. Speaking on Facebook, Alexei Honcharенko, a member of Ukraine's parliament, claimed the attacks has led to the taking of territory before adding that he didn't know what the plan was. However, he claimed it would show Europeans and Americans that Russia can and needs to be attacked. Again, the message here is to support Ukraine in crossing even more red lines. After all, this is the first time since World War II that any Russian territory has been occupied by an opposing force. And as Honcharенko points out, Putin did not turn to nukes and so on, meaning Ukraine is showing the world that the world should not be scared of escalation or the reaction of Putin. Another humiliation for Putin. Despite all of the threats he's made during the war, which have included threats of deploying tactical nuclear weapons, red line after red line has now been crossed. Now he has Ukrainian troops in his territory and he hasn't followed through on any of his threats. Is that because he's smart enough to know that going nuclear would lead to World War III? Or is he not following through on his threats because he knows that Russia couldn't handle a war with NATO and the US after having depleted itself so thoroughly in Ukraine? Back in Russia, Andrei Belyusov, who became Russia's defense minister in May 2024 after previously serving as the country's first deputy prime minister for 4 years, faces his first major test. Part of passing that test appears to be taking part in the Kremlin's efforts to turn the incursion into pro-Russian propaganda. Putin is spearheading this campaign, claiming on the second day of the incursion that Ukraine's actions were not only a major provocation, but that its soldiers were firing indiscriminately at civilians, their homes, and Kursk's public buildings. Those claims aren't yet confirmed. Militaristically, Russia has clearly sent forces into Kursk to push back the Ukrainian advance, though it's unclear how successful they've been. Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of general staff, claims that Russia is continuing to destroy the adversary in areas directly adjacent to the Russian-Ukrainian border. That's a statement vague enough to suggest that Ukraine is still in Kursk and Russia hasn't been able to repel the 1,000 soldiers in the territory just yet. Even worse for the Kremlin is that these public claims of pushing back Ukraine are being disputed on Telegram, which is Russia's most popular social media channel. Several pro-war channels on the network claim the situation is far worse for Russia than the politicians are claiming. One such channel, Rybar, says that the situation is continuing to deteriorate, while noting that Ukrainian formations were advancing towards towns. Again, those claims aren't confirmed either. It all adds up to a confused state of affairs, in which we know Ukrainian soldiers are in Kursk, but we're still uncertain exactly how successful or otherwise they are following the initial taking of villages and a gas distribution station. Add claims of captured Russian soldiers into the mix and you get even more confusion. An August 9th report in the Kyiv Independent claims that drone footage published by Ukraine shows 32 captured Russian soldiers, adding that the Telegram post that showcased the footage claimed that a further 8 were out of frame. More claims were being made, but they offered yet another example of claims that can't be verified independently. What is clear is that the Kursk incursion shows a change in Ukrainian tactics. For over 2 years, it has bedded into its own territory, fortifying to enable it to defend against slow Russian advances. That approach has proved lethal for Russia. It's lost 588,540 soldiers since the start of the war, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. But now, whittling away at the seemingly never-ending stream of soldiers Putin is sending into Ukraine isn't enough for Zelensky. The incursion into Kursk shows that Ukraine is willing to go on the attack, which will send shockwaves throughout Russia as Putin realizes that his country is no longer safe behind the front lines of the Ukraine war. That change in approach could lead to consequences for Ukraine in the long run. That could especially be the case in Africa, where the BBC claims Ukraine has been trying to win allies during the war with Russia. Over the last 3 days, Mali and Niger have both cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine, ostensibly over comments by a Ukrainian military official who suggested that Ukraine may have played a role in the killing of several dozen Malian soldiers in July 2024. Those soldiers were working alongside mercenaries from the infamous Wagner Group and were apparently killed in clashes with Al-Qaeda-linked militants. Andriy Yusov claimed in the immediate aftermath that the separatist rebels the Malian soldiers fought received the necessary information they needed to carry out their attacks. An unsubstantiated comment, but one that has triggered Mali, Niger, and Senegal to cut ties with Ukraine, all coincidentally right as Ukrainian troops entered Kursk. It's possible that the Kremlin put pressure on all three to do so, with Ukraine calling Mali's decision short-sighted and hasty, while claiming that it complies with all aspects of international law. Perhaps Ukraine wasn't involved in the killing of Malian troops at all. Instead, we may be seeing Russian influence-based politics at play again, as it labels Ukraine as the aggressor while using the Kursk incursion to prove its point. Ukraine loses 3 potential African allies, or at least 3 countries with which it could deepen diplomatic ties, and Russia forces a small propaganda victory. That's all conjecture, but it shows that Ukraine's differing approach to handling Russia could have ramifications on a wider scale. What isn't conjecture is that Ukraine's latest actions aren't part of the Russian plan. None of this is. The special military operation in Ukraine was supposed to be short, sharp, and devastating. Now Russia is bogged down in a protracted war that has not only cost it hundreds of thousands of soldiers and huge amounts of military equipment, but is now seeing it lose territory to a country that it's trying to conquer. The plan is failing. And with that, we'll ask you what you think about Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. Is this the start of a new approach that will see Ukraine taking even more Russian territory in the future? Or is it a short-term crossing of a red line designed to stretch Russia's troops? How do you think Putin will respond to the humiliation he's experienced as a result of this incursion?
What on earth are North Korean soldiers doing in Kursk, Russia? It's a baffling image. Soldiers from one of the world's most secretive regimes stationed thousands of miles away in Russia, in the middle of its war against Ukraine. But the explanation is as strange as the question, an alliance between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un that brings echoes of Cold War politics into the 21st century. So what's the deal? Is this about ideology, strategy, or something more desperate? How on earth did this unlikely alliance come to pass? That's a good question, given that North Korea isn't looking to take over Ukraine itself. But the reasons stem back to a defensive pact that Putin and North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un created back in 2024. The pact, which North Korea officially ratified on November 12, 2024, right around the time that Putin launched his Kursk counteroffensive, obliges each nation to come to the other's aid if they come under attack. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's almost exactly the same setup NATO has under Article 5 of its charter. If one NATO country is attacked, all respond as though they were attacked. If Russia is attacked, North Korea sends its soldiers to defend its ally. That's precisely what we're seeing now in Kursk. Ukraine's early August invasion was intended to capture territory Ukraine could later use as a bargaining chip against Russia. It would hand Kursk back over to Russia if Putin delivered some, perhaps all, of the territory he's taken in Ukraine. While that still may be the case, what's happened in Kursk also appears to have triggered Russia and North Korea's well-timed defensive pact. North Koreans are streaming into Russia because Ukraine attacked Kursk. Putin is using that invasion as an excuse to introduce a whole new country to the conflict. And he's already receiving thousands of North Korean soldiers. On October 18, 2024, the BBC was among the first to report on the arrival of North Korean soldiers in Russia. It noted that South Korea's leading spy agency believed that President Kim had sent at least 1,500 troops into Russia. The real number was likely much higher. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country's intelligence information suggested around 10,000 North Koreans had arrived. South Korean media outlets believe the number was even higher than that, with a 12,000 figure being bandied around. It now appears that either Zelensky or the South Korean press were right. The number is at least 10,000, according to the Kyiv Independent, and almost all of them were being sent to a very specific part of Russia. Pentagon spokesperson Vedant Patel offers details. Today I can confirm that over 10,000 North Korean soldiers have been sent to eastern Russia, and most of them have moved to the far western Kursk Oblast, where they have begun engaging in combat operations with Russian forces, he claimed. Patel also noted that the North Koreans were being trained to use Russia's artillery and unmanned aerial vehicles. They were also learning about trench clearing, a key skill given that the Ukraine war has seen heavy use of trenches in fortifications like those Ukraine had built in Kursk. It all added up to a terrifying prospect for Ukraine, and it only got worse from there. On November 10, 2024, the New York Times revealed that Ukraine had far more to worry about than the 10,000 to 12,000 North Korean soldiers arriving in Russia. Putin had something much bigger planned, a counteroffensive using a combined force of Russian and North Korean soldiers containing as many as 50,000 troops. Thanks to the inclusion of North Korea, Putin was able to amass this force without having to pull any of his own soldiers out of the ongoing offensives in the Donbass. Russia was now finally ready to fight a war on multiple fronts, one that would allow it to maintain its focus in Ukraine whilst getting rid of the invaders that had stormed the Kursk Oblast. At least that's the narrative Putin and his Kremlin cronies would have you believe. The New York Times predicted on November 10th that the attack of the 50,000 would arrive in the coming days. That prediction turned out to be prophetic. On November 12, 2024, reports emerged that Putin had sent his 50,000 soldiers into Kursk to take back Russian territory in what was supposed to be a glorious few days for Russia's leader. Finally, he would overcome the humiliation that Ukraine's invasion had caused, winning back the faith of the Russian people in the process. Only it hasn't worked out that way. Russia's Kursk counteroffensive is in the process of crumbling as Ukraine whittles away at the 50,000 soldiers Putin has sent. But let's backtrack for a moment. On November 12th, the Times of India YouTube channel published a video highlighting the early stages of Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. It claimed that Ukraine's army fretted as Russia took it by storm with its 50,000 soldiers. The Times of India also confirmed the reports that North Korean soldiers were part of the 50,000, while adding that Zelensky believes the number to be accurate. All of these claims were accompanied by footage showing explosions and strikes against what appear to be Ukrainian vehicles and positions. It didn't paint a good picture of Ukraine's prospects. Still, there was an interesting claim within the video. Zelensky, in a post on Telegram following a briefing from General Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, stated that Ukrainian troops continue to hold back the nearly 50,000-strong enemy group in Kursk. Russia hadn't won, and it certainly hadn't succeeded in decimating Ukraine's troops in Kursk as Putin would have hoped. Instead, the counter-offensive saw Russia's leader rely on the same wave-based attacks he's used so often inside Ukraine. Battalions were sent toward Ukraine's positions, followed by more, and then yet more, as Putin began feeding his soldiers into a brand new meat grinder. But there was a problem for Russia's leader. Ukraine understands exactly how Putin operates at this point. These wave-based assaults are nothing new, and Ukraine also saw that a fifth of the 50,000 were North Koreans who had received less than a month's training, if that, in using Russian weapons. The counteroffensive sounded far more impressive on paper than it would be in reality. Ukraine would soon set about proving that fact. Russia's initial offensive collapsed spectacularly. The first signs of this collapse appeared on the social media platform Reddit. A user by the name of CapableLaw7184 shared an article published by the Kyiv Post, claiming that the first assault on Kursk had become a black day for Russia. Further examination of the article reveals more details. The Kyiv Post claims that Russia began a powerful offensive on November 12th, sending an entire battalion to attack the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade in Kursk. The brigade's press officer, Anastasia Blishik, said things went very poorly for Putin and his ramshackle assembly of soldiers and armored vehicles. Yesterday was a truly black day for the Russian occupiers who tried to storm in 5 to 6 waves, claimed Blishik. The Russians tried to attack with vehicles, with paratroopers, and storm Ukrainian settlements, the press officer added before confirming Ukraine had destroyed 10 units of armored vehicles. Ukraine made clever use of its weapons to destroy the Russian battalion, laying mines in strategic locations, allowing it to take out at least a trio of armored transporters, with first-person visual drones wreaking havoc on the rest of Russia's equipment. Stugna anti-tank systems also allowed Ukraine to destroy the larger vehicles in Russia's initial fleet, and it wasn't just the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade getting involved in the fighting. As Blishik revealed, other armored vehicles were destroyed by our adjacent units. A group of invaders was also liquidated, and those who survived scattered through the fields. Liquidated is a terrifying term, but it appears accurate. Build analyst Julian Ropka reveals that this initial counteroffensive in Kursk actually went on for 3 days, starting on November 9th. During that time, Ropka claims, Ukraine wiped out 28 armored vehicle units and a staggering 200 soldiers, who were either killed or wounded by Ukraine's drones and explosives. Ropka didn't mince words about what this means, calling it a catastrophe for Putin and his generals. Putin had sent his first joint contingent of Russian and North Korean soldiers into Kursk. That battalion contained just a few hundred of the 50,000 he had lying in wait, but it was destroyed. Ukraine eliminated those first few waves in a matter of days, while barely taking any casualties on its own side. It's a story that's repeated itself so many times during the war. Putin has the numbers, but his tactical ineptitude leads him to sending hundreds of soldiers to the slaughter for practically no gain. Hundreds will soon turn into thousands for the 50,000 soldiers Putin has amassed to retake Kursk. After the failed initial offensive, you might think that Putin would step back for a moment to lick his wounds and reconsider his approach. You'd be wrong. Russia's leader is nothing if not headstrong, and he's simply started sending even more soldiers into Kursk in hopes of dislodging Ukraine from its positions. Those new waves are failing even more spectacularly than the first. At least that's according to The Telegraph. On the same day that the Kyiv Post reported on the fate of Russia's initial battalion, the UK-based media outlet laid Putin's full failure bare. It says that Russia is losing a staggering 2,000 soldiers daily trying to recapture Kursk as it attempts to maintain its offensive in eastern Ukraine. Again, we see signs that Putin is unable to adjust his tactics in the wake of massive losses. The 2,000 per day figure is around double the already enormous 1,000 losses per day Russia experienced during its summer offensives. The Telegraph also revealed more details about Russia's failure in Kursk. The outlet published a video supposedly showing a column of Russian armored vehicles, each believed to be carrying 30 soldiers, blowing up one after the other as they attempted to make their way through a Ukrainian minefield. Those soldiers never even had a chance to confront Ukraine's troops directly. They were decimated en route, with each vehicle being forced to blindly follow the one that exploded before, its drivers hoping they wouldn't be the ones to navigate the mines. None made it through. There were also updates on Ukraine's kill count. The Ukrainian blogger Deep State claimed that some of the early fighting focused on a village named Novoivanovka, located about 10 miles away from Sudza, which Ukraine uses as its control center in Kursk. The village has seen constant fighting, all going Ukraine's way. About 2/3 of the armored vehicles Russia sent to the village have already been destroyed, with 300 soldiers losing their lives. Despite all of this evidence, Russian military bloggers are trying to push the narrative that Putin's Kursk counteroffensive is actually successful. On the social media platform Telegram, the Two Majors channel claimed that Ukraine's equipment was failing them. Towards Sudza, the Ukrainian armed forces are using captured construction equipment to move through muddy roads because their equipment is getting stuck. Even as hundreds of Russian and North Korean soldiers are losing their lives in Kursk, Putin's mouthpieces are still pushing the narrative that Ukraine's NATO-supplied equipment isn't up to the job. The footage published so far seems to reveal otherwise. All of this leads us to ask the obvious question: what happens next? It's important to note that Putin's Kursk counteroffensive is still in its early days. Ukraine is far from out of the woods, as the majority of the 50,000 Russian and North Korean soldiers are still waiting to be deployed. But the early signs aren't good for Russia. It's now losing 2,000 people a day in Kursk and the Donbass. Even if we conservatively say that Ukraine is killing 500 of those 2,000 in Kursk, we get a clear sign that Putin's manpower-heavy approach isn't going to do him much good. It'll take just 100 days for Ukraine to deplete the 50,000 to nothing if the rate of Russian casualties is sustained. It may even get the job done quicker if we assume that Putin will intensify his attacks with larger waves as the days roll on. For its part, Ukraine is managing to hold the line as it inflicts horrible casualties on the Russian and North Korean soldiers. And it could do even more if Zelensky has his way. According to the Kyiv Independent, Ukraine's president believes he could practically demolish the combined Russian and North Korean effort if the West allows Ukraine to use long-range missiles like Storm Shadow and ATACMS inside Russia. With those missiles, Ukraine could target every camp where North Korean troops are gathering in Russia, destroying them to the point where Putin's 50,000-man assault collapses before it can truly begin. That permission still isn't forthcoming, despite speculation back in September that the US and UK were considering allowing the use of their weapons. Even without those weapons, Ukraine will hold the line and absorb every soldier Putin sends its way. If it's as effective fighting against the 50,000-strong counteroffensive as it has been so far in Kursk, it'll likely overcome Russia's attempts to take back its territory. Since August, according to Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, Russia has already seen Ukraine kill 7,905 of its soldiers, injuring a further 12,220 and capturing over 700 in Kursk alone. Now that Putin is pouring troops into Kursk, those numbers are likely to rocket up, as Ukraine has large contingents on which to focus its fire. As for Putin, he's still refusing to confirm whether there are North Korean soldiers in the 50,000 that he sent to Kursk. Frankly, he doesn't need to. There's plenty of video evidence to suggest that they're there, with the Pentagon's claims we mentioned earlier being enough to confirm that North Koreans are indeed fighting in the Russian oblast. Zelensky also has a positive spin on Putin's Kursk counteroffensive. Speaking after receiving a briefing from Alexander Syrsky, Zelensky said, "Our men are holding back 50,000 of the occupier's army personnel who, due to the Kursk operation, cannot be deployed to other Russian offensive directions on our territory." In other words, Putin being so focused on Kursk relieves some of the pressure Ukraine faces in Donetsk and the Donbass, just as Ukraine planned. For Putin, his initial failures in the Kursk counteroffensive likely won't change his plans. He'll send more of the 50,000, sacrificing both Russians and North Koreans to the altar of his own pride. The tactics won't change. Even more armored vehicles will be lost along with people. The only question remaining is whether the meat grinder approach that has been so faltering in Ukraine will serve him any better as he tries to retake Kursk. Early evidence suggests that it won't. But what do you think about what Ukraine has managed to achieve in Kursk so far? Will Putin's combined Russian and North Korean forces be depleted before they can retake the oblast? Might the US and UK finally allow Ukraine to use their long-range missiles to preemptively strike the camps of the 50,000? Ukraine's forces have achieved the unthinkable. They've crossed the Russian border, launching a surprise invasion that left Moscow reeling. The question now echoing in the Kremlin and around the world is, how did this happen? How could Russia, with all its might, have failed in its most fundamental task, preventing an invasion on its own soil? As of this script's writing, Russia's so-called special military operation to reclaim Ukrainian land has turned into a nightmare, 900 days in, and it's Ukraine that's rewriting the rules of this conflict. Even if by the time you watch this video Ukraine has been pushed back across its border, the war has changed forever. But to understand Russia's catastrophic failure, we need to explore a critical factor that has ironically aided its collapse more than any Ukrainian offensive ever could: NATO's restraint. Throughout this conflict, the West and Putin have been locked in a tense game of cat and mouse. The West has cautiously escalated its involvement, delivering increasingly capable weapons to Ukraine. Each time, Putin responded with his usual threat to unleash nuclear devastation, and each time, the West hesitated. The debates over sending modern tanks raged for over a year until Britain finally said, "Hold my tea," and broke the deadlock by sending a few Challenger tanks to Ukraine. Yet despite these breakthroughs, the top-tier equipment came with strings attached. In a bid to avoid provoking Putin's wrath, Western powers imposed heavy restrictions. Weapons couldn't be provided to Russian rebel forces. Ukraine was initially forbidden from launching strikes into Crimea, and any cross-border attacks by Ukrainian forces were strictly off-limits. This was a severe handicap for Ukraine, as Russia exploited its ability to launch attacks from behind the safety of its border, where it was shielded from Ukrainian retaliation. To grasp the absurdity of this situation, picture a boxing match. Ukraine is up against an opponent with a much longer reach, Russia, but Ukraine is forbidden from getting close enough to land a punch, while Russia is free to jab at will. It's not hard to see how this fight could end. Then this past summer, the stakes rose dramatically. Russia began massing troops and equipment just across the border from Kharkiv, preparing for a massive offensive. Ukrainian intelligence had warned of a looming assault, but the exact location remained a mystery until the shelling began. With 50,000 troops poised to strike, Ukraine found itself in a desperate situation. But in a surprising turn, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use American long-range munitions to disrupt the Russian advance. For the first time in the war, Ukraine was allowed to strike Russian forces on their own soil. HIMARS rockets, both GMLRS and ATACMS, rained down on Russian troop concentrations, vehicles and equipment, crippling the Kharkiv offensive. In one strike, Ukraine unleashed over 120 precision rockets, shattering Russian forces on their side of the border. President Biden had given authorization for American weapons to be used in a limited fashion inside of Russian territory, responding to Russian attacks or within a certain distance from the border. This still placed the vast majority of Russian high-value targets, such as airfields, out of reach, but it ensured that Russia could not mass forces on its side of the border without being harassed ever again. But nobody could have guessed how the paradigm would radically shift once again just 2 months later. Even after suffering a defeat in the Kharkiv offensive and taking significant casualties in cross-border missile and rocket attacks, Russia still believed that the old paradigm was still in play. NATO would never dare authorize Ukrainian military action into Russia itself, aside from the use of long-range munitions. After all, Putin had spent 2 years at this point rolling out the old nuclear saber and rattling it, making sure the West would self-deter as much as possible. This brings us to the situation on the Kursk border with Ukraine right before the UAF invasion. To say that Russia has fought this war in extreme luxury would be an understatement. Despite Putin's propaganda that NATO poses an existential threat to Russia, it's not stopped him from stripping troops and equipment from all of his shared borders with NATO countries. Even the Kaliningrad exclave has seen massive drawdowns for service in Ukraine. This is because despite the rhetoric, Putin knows that NATO does not and never did want a military confrontation with Russia. Thus, he's free to leave nothing more than a token force on his borders with NATO. This same understanding stretched to Ukraine. While Russian targets in Ukraine were finally free game for the UAF, Putin's fundamental understanding of the rules of this conflict was that Ukraine would never dare invade Russian territory, and especially not with NATO equipment. Sure, small cross-border raids by separatist groups were an ongoing concern, but these raids were easily rebuffed after only a few days and inflicted barely any political or military cost on the Kremlin. Thus, Russia has historically only secured its border with Ukraine with forces large enough to deter small-scale raids and respond to an eventual skirmish, but not large enough to stop a conventional force looking to seize and hold Russian territory. FSB border security troops and conscripts make up the bulk of Russian border forces and are spread thin as is, far thinner than would be the case in a normal war between two neighboring nations. If this were a normal war, Russia would maintain large garrisons all across its border with Ukraine, along with picket forces meant to detect an invasion attempt that the nearest garrison force would then immediately respond to.
Ukraine lacks the manpower to require a full-scale defense of the border, but even this economic strategy would still require tens of thousands of soldiers given the several hundred miles of border between the two nations that's still controlled by Ukraine. However, because Ukraine's hands are tied by its Western partners, Russia doesn't have to secure its border, even with this greatly reduced force level. It's instead free to send those tens of thousands of soldiers and all of their supporting equipment into the front lines inside Ukraine itself, leaving its border secured with far less well-equipped and trained paramilitary forces and conscripts. This has helped put considerable strain on the Ukrainian defenders, who still have to maintain their own border security forces out of fear Russia could quickly assemble an invasion force on its side of the border with little to no notice. And unlike their Russian counterparts, these border forces need to have armored vehicles and air defense systems, or else Ukraine could suffer a catastrophic flanking attack that could threaten to collapse the front. It's easy to see where this is going. Early in August, Ukraine exploited this complacency to stunning success. The second point of failure in Russia's defense of its border came from ignoring reports by its border troops. FSB border troops and their conscript augmentees began reporting unusual Ukrainian activity in late July, growing in concern as they believed that possibly a major raid was going to take place. We likely won't know the real answer until well after this war is concluded and the archives unsealed, but it's likely that Russia ignored these reports out of, again, its sense of complacency. If Ukraine was massing troops on the border, then it was just a ploy to get them to redeploy forces from the front in the east, where Russia was and continues to make incremental gains. However, this being Russia and the full scope of its incompetency now known to outside observers, it's also just as likely that these reports never made it up the chain of command. And if they did, then they weren't shared with the rest of the Russian defense apparatus. Russia lacks a unified chain of command between the FSB, its National Guard, and the regular military, and there's no telling where a point of failure could have occurred, but the opportunities are plentiful. What's clear is that Russia's deep complacency extended even to carrying out surveillance of its wartime border. The Ukrainian invasion went off without a hitch, kept in absolute secrecy until the very last minute, a testament to Ukraine's ability to maintain strong operational security. However, there's simply no excuse for Russia to not have been conducting aggressive surveillance of its border at all times. Russian patrols equipped with surveillance drones should have been sufficient to detect the buildup of forces and raise the alarm. The third point of failure is Russia's unprepared physical defenses. Ukraine took a lot of heat in the Kharkiv direction when it was discovered that despite the threat of Russian invasion, local commanders had not strongly fortified against a Russian assault. Yet the difference between the Ukrainian defenses north of Kharkiv and Russia's border defenses is significant. Best reporting states that the Russians had set up as much as 2 lines of trenches, but these were very sparingly manned. There were defensive fortifications where Ukrainians met stiff resistance, but upon making contact, the Ukrainian invasion force simply drove past them. Cut off from the rear, defenders were forced to flee, surrender, or put up a doomed last stand. This is best exemplified by the performance of Chechen fighters on the border. There were elements of the Chechen 141st Special Motorized Regiment, also known as Kadyrivets for their loyalty to Chechenya's head Ramzan Kadyrov. Another moniker they go by is Akhmat Special Forces, and they have a fierce reputation, feared even by Russian troops as some of the best, most aggressive fighters in the entire Russian armed forces. At least up until February 24th of 2022. When faced with real combat, these TikTok warriors were soon discovered to break and run more often than not. They repeated this performance in the Kursk Oblast, where dozens of Chechens were captured with Ukraine showing off their documentation as proof, while the commander of local Akhmat forces fled to the safety of the rear. In a TikTok video, he claimed that the reason Akhmat had failed to defend the border is that Ukrainians simply drove past them. Captured Chechen travel documents would say otherwise. The failures to coordinate a defense are not just due to physical deficiencies though, but also critical failures in planning, strategy, and command and control. First, Russia failed to create a realistic defensive plan in case of incursion. Faced with the prospect of defending such a long border with limited troops, Russia would have been better served by creating pickets along the border. Every dozen miles or so and several miles behind the border, rapid response forces armed with drones, armored vehicles, and man-portable air defenses should have been stationed. Upon contact, picket forces would have been instructed to report the attack and break contact, trading very low military value territory for time. Rapid response forces would then be assembled from all neighboring encampments, assembled into a combined force, and sent to counterattack. The combined response force could then fight a delaying action if facing a significantly more powerful enemy, or deliver a counterattack to push invaders back across the border. In the meantime, response forces from encampments further away would have time to assemble, delivering augmentation forces to the front within 24 to 48 hours. This strategy would have served Russia's limited manpower pool very well, given that it would have been possible to fully man the border with multiple defensive lines all fully staffed. However, there's a plethora of reasons it was beyond the reach of Russia. The first is the fact that Russia's current border and regional forces do not share a joint chain of command. This is hardly new, as even inside Ukraine the regular Russian army struggles to perform joint operations between its branches, sometimes even between larger Russian units. Combined arms operations continue to be out of reach of Russia, and especially so in its poorly defended border. With a combination of conscripts and other forces, local commanders found themselves at odds with each other over how to react to the Ukrainian invasion, and the problem persists even a week after it began. Currently, Russia is planning its counterattack to contain the UAF, but this plan is being met with extreme skepticism. The most obvious problem comes from the composition of the forces assigned to Kursk, currently the Russian National Guard, Russian FSB Border Guard Service, Interior Ministry troops, conscripts from the regular army, PMCs, and other irregular forces have all been tapped for the response. All of these share completely independent command structures, and there exists no joint command structure between them. As usual, Russia is having to make it up as it goes along due to a lack of planning, and given their troubles with regular army forces in Ukraine, there's little reason to believe that a Russian response to Ukraine's invasion is going to be well coordinated or particularly effective. Particularly effective does not mean fruitless though. Russia still has a lot of manpower it's willing to send into the meat grinder. Compared to Ukrainian forces though, who by all accounts are made up of hardened combat veterans and experienced commanders, the Russian response is unlikely to be an efficient one. This time though, Russia may not be able to meat grinder its way to victory for one very specific reason. As the Ukrainians invaded Kursk, Russian units were either taken so by surprise, overwhelmed by the violence and speed of the assault, or destroyed in fighting. By and large, the UAF was going up against conscripts, whom by Russian law cannot be used as expeditionary forces outside of Russian borders. This hasn't stopped some numbers of conscripts from ending up in Ukraine, but even Putin has been extremely sensitive to the mass use of conscripts in combat. Shortly after the invasion, he personally met with mothers of conscripted soldiers who had accidentally been sent to Ukraine and has made efforts to prevent it from happening again. These conscripts are notoriously poorly trained and terribly equipped. Even in peacetime, they suffer from extreme levels of physical and sexual abuse, low morale, and very poor quality equipment and training. There's little indication that things have changed in wartime, and Russia's border conscripts have performed as expected, with the UAF taking hundreds of conscripts prisoner and inflicting a yet unverified but seemingly high level of casualties on the rest. Russian troops dying en masse in meat grinder battles of attrition is nothing new. What is new, this time, is that photos and videos of dead conscripts are making the rounds on social media, but they aren't dying in distant battlefields, they're dying on the front lawns of Russian homes. One infamous example is a HIMARS ambush of a Russian reinforcement convoy, with the convoy destroyed directly in front of a row of Russian homes. Visual estimates of the casualties count around 3 dozen dead. Ukraine states that as of the writing of this script at the end of the first week of the invasion, it's taken 2,000 Russian prisoners of war. And there's little reason to doubt this figure is more or less correct, given the number of videos and photos shared via Telegram and other social media. In these videos, we can see Ukrainian forces detaining groups of up to 2 dozen at a time, with one video showing 30 individuals surrendering at once. Normally, it's prudent to be wary of media manipulation. This is a war after all, and social media is a powerful tool. But the depth of Ukrainian penetration into Russian territory and the wealth of evidence strongly hints that the Ukrainian figures are more correct than not. There's also mounting pressure from the Russian population itself concerning conscript deaths and capture. A movement meant to bring awareness to the killing and capture of conscripts quickly grew in popularity shortly after the start of the invasion, spearheaded by Russian mothers concerned for their own children conscripted into the military. Putin seems to be aware of the sensitivity of conscript deaths within the Russian population, an odd occurrence for a society with an extremely high threshold for pain in terms of regular war casualties. Ukraine may have been counting on this, with conscript deaths and captures feeding into its strategy. Many have wondered at the purpose of the invasion, with some criticizing it for taking troops away from a front where Ukraine is being steadily pushed back across many sections. Yet the death of Russian conscripted youth is already achieving an effect that scores of dead Russian contract soldiers isn't. The casualties are only likely to mount though, as reports are that only small amounts of forces are being pulled from the front as of the writing of this script. Instead, it seems like conscripts will play a role in the attempted retaking of Kursk, and the fact that the Kremlin seems to have no real plan does not bode well for these forces. It took 3 days for Putin to react to the Ukrainian invasion, a sure sign that nobody in this chain of command had a plan in place to deal with such an incursion. When Putin did respond, it was immediately clear that there still existed no plan for countering the invasion. The mixed nature of the planned response is indicative of how poorly prepared Russia was and continues to be.
1,000 days. That's how long Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has dragged on. 1,000 days into a war that was supposed to last just 3, and Russia finds itself in freefall. Ukraine, against all odds, has turned the tide, not just holding the line, but grinding Russia's military into dust. Staggering troop losses, shattered equipment, and crumbling morale paint a grim picture for the Kremlin. Putin's grand gamble has backfired spectacularly, and the cracks in his war machine are now impossible to ignore. But what sealed Russia's fate? The answer lies in a daring moment that reshaped the battlefield: the Kursk incursion. On August 6, 2024, Ukraine launched a surprise offensive into Russia's Kursk Oblast, catching Moscow completely off guard. Ukrainian forces quickly breached Russian defenses, capturing dozens of square miles of Russian territory within the first few days. By the end of the first week, Ukraine had secured around 386 square miles of land, and Russian authorities had been forced to declare a state of emergency. In other words, it took Ukrainian troops only a week to show the world just how fragile Russia's position truly is. Naturally, for Russia, this incursion was a humiliating blow. After all, we aren't talking about a border skirmish, we're talking about a full-scale breach into Russian territory. A breach that awarded Putin a not-so-flattering title: the first Russian leader in modern history to have foreign troops on Russian soil. However, the Ukrainian troops haven't been just holding ground, they've been inflicting serious damage on Russia's military infrastructure. Ukrainian artillery and drones have been hammering Russian positions, leaving a trail of destroyed vehicles, tanks, and equipment. But that's not even the worst part. Thousands of Russian soldiers have also been sent to an early grave, with each day claiming more of the country's already strained forces. To put it simply, it's a slaughter for Russia. A slaughter that shows no signs of slowing down. In fact, it only seems to be getting worse. The deadliest days for Russian troops are no longer early 2022 when the invasion first began. They're now in November 2024, as the battlefield becomes more unforgiving with every passing day. But words alone don't do justice to the scale of these losses. The numbers tell the true story of Russia's unraveling. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost 725,740 troops from February 24, 2022 to November 20, 2024. That's nearly 750,000 lives shattered in less than 3 years, and the toll keeps rising. As of November 20th, the deadliest day for Russian troops was November 11th, when they lost nearly 2,000 soldiers, or 1,950 to be precise. To put this into perspective, that's almost as many military personnel the United States lost during 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Yes, you heard that right. Between October 7, 2001 and August 30, 2021, the US suffered a total of 2,324 combat deaths. Russia nearly matched this number in casualties in just 24 hours. The scale of this bloodshed truly defies comprehension. But November 11th was no isolated incident. The record that was broken that day was set the day before, on November 10th, which was also reported as Russia's deadliest day since the beginning of the invasion, with 1,770 losses. The previous record, 1,740 Russian losses, was set on May 13th, mere days after Russia launched an offensive operation in Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast. But this doesn't mean that the early days of November were merciful for Russia. On November 8th, the country lost 1,660 troops. On November 4th, it was 1,260. November 1st claimed 1,270. You get the picture. October, previously the deadliest month for Russian forces, recorded 41,980 casualties, an average of roughly 1,350 per day. Yet November is shaping up to surpass even that grim milestone, with the last few days in November recording losses well over 1,500 a day. November 19th, 1,690. November 18th, 1,610. November 17th, 1,560. November 16th, 1,640. November 15th, 1,650. November 14th, 1,520. November 13th, 1,690. November 12th, 1,770. This devastation has led many to label what's unfolding in Kursk as nothing short of a massacre. Videos circulating online show hundreds of Russian vehicles obliterated, some with troops still inside, highlighting the utter futility of Moscow's repeated assaults. Of course, Russia wouldn't be Russia if it didn't try to spin things around. Russian soldiers have also been posting videos and photos of their battleground successes in Kursk. One such instance involves a Russian soldier proudly posing next to a Ukrainian Leopard 2 tank that his unit supposedly hit and captured. Given that Leopard 2 tanks are highly advanced and relatively scarce in Ukraine's arsenal, this was quite the achievement, right? Well, not quite. Upon closer inspection, this tank turned out to be nothing more than a decoy, a well-crafted decoy, but a decoy nonetheless. This bizarre display of desperation perfectly sums up the contrast between Russia's propaganda and the reality on the ground. This contrast has become so significant that Russian commanders have reportedly been arrested for exaggerating battlefield gains. According to recent reports, these arrests stem from Moscow's growing frustration with the gap between the glowing victories portrayed in state media and the catastrophic losses being suffered in Kursk. In a shocking turn of events, several mid-level and senior officers were accused of fabricating reports to appease higher-ups, overstating territorial gains and inflating Ukrainian losses. The goal of these false claims was to shield the commanders from criticism and disciplinary actions. However, they only managed to fuel the Kremlin's delusions about the state of the war. Yet another major miscalculation. So now, with Kursk turning into a disaster of unprecedented scale, the Kremlin's crackdown on its own commanders showcases the chaos and paranoia within Russia's military leadership. However, the fact that Russian commanders felt compelled to do this in the first place exposes another thing. The Russian chain of command is completely fractured. But as the Kursk debacle continues, no amount of doctor reports or arrests can mask the truth of Russia's mounting failures. But it's not just manpower that's being bled dry. Russia's equipment is also taking a brutal beating. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, as of November 20th, Russia has lost an astounding 9,390 tanks, 19,119 armored vehicles, and 20,681 artillery systems. These losses also extend to Russia's aerial and naval fleet, with 369 airplanes, 329 helicopters, and 28 ships and boats destroyed. Even drones, a crucial tool for modern warfare, haven't escaped unscathed. Over 19,202 Russian unmanned aerial vehicles have been taken out of action so far. November alone has added significantly to these staggering totals. In just one day, November 19th, Ukrainian forces reportedly took out 8 tanks, 27 armored personnel vehicles, 49 artillery systems, and 91 drones. And remember the deadliest day for the Russians, November 11th? Well, that single day claimed 23 tanks and 81 armored personnel vehicles. November added a couple more dismal milestones to Russia's depressing track record. As of November 20th, Russia has officially lost over 1,000 anti-aircraft systems. While Russia passed 4 digits in this department, it's quickly approaching a devastating 5-digit number in total. A total of 29,648 vehicles and fuel tanks have been lost so far, with November 19th adding another 100 to the tally. It's only a matter of time before Russia's vehicle losses surpass the mind-blowing 30,000 mark. Each new day seems to bring another chapter of devastation to Moscow's war effort, and the worst part is that Russia cannot possibly replace these vital resources at the pace required. Now, you might wonder, isn't Russia's economy on a war footing? With all the resources pouring into the defense industry, how is it possible that it can't keep up? Well, the answer is simple. The losses are just too big. Russia's production lines, stretched to their limits, simply can't match the ferocious pace of destruction. Take large caliber cannon barrels, for instance. According to Oryx, a Dutch open-source intelligence defense analysis website that records documented equipment losses, Russia loses over 320 tank and artillery cannon barrels per month. However, Russia's 2 rotary forges, critical for producing these components, can churn out only 20 barrels monthly. That's a replacement rate of less than 7%. A catastrophic mismatch. Worse still, Russia can't expand its production capacity because the skills and equipment required are controlled by specialist firms abroad, such as Austria's GFM, and given the sanctions, the prospect of acquiring any necessary parts is close to zero. Fighting vehicles tell a similar story. Since the war began, Russia has lost roughly 155 infantry fighting vehicles, according to Oryx. Russian defense manufacturers can produce about 200 per year, or approximately 17 per month, which means they have the capacity to replenish these losses in less than a year. However, sustaining this level of production while also dealing with other categories of equipment losses and maintaining combat operations stretches Russian industry to its limits. Even with the older models scavenged from Soviet-era stockpiles, these reserves won't last indefinitely, raising questions about Russia's ability to keep up over the long term. Russia's artillery production has reportedly tripled to an annual rate of 3 million shells, which sounds impressive. Well, that is until you consider its consumption rate. While Russia is no longer firing the 12 million rounds expended in 2022, estimates suggest its current usage still far outstrips production. This has forced Moscow to rely heavily on imports, such as North Korean shells, which now make up nearly 50% of the artillery used in Ukraine. But shells aren't the only thing coming from North Korea. Beyond artillery, North Korea has provided long-range rocket and artillery systems, including 50 domestically produced 170mm M1989 self-propelled howitzers and 20 upgraded 240mm multiple-launch rocket systems. These contributions mark a deepening military partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang, one that shows just how destroyed Russia's defense capabilities are. However, North Korean contributions to the equipment department weren't the most controversial. North Korean troops have arrived in Russia too. As of early November, Pyongyang has deployed around 11,000 soldiers to bolster Russia's efforts in the Kursk Oblast. At the same time, reports suggest that this number could increase in the coming weeks. Divided into assault and support units, these North Korean forces are now integral to Russia's strategy in the region. Yet these troops face significant vulnerabilities. They're poorly trained and equipped, lack battle experience, and don't even understand the language spoken around them. That's why many military experts have labeled them as nothing more than cannon fodder for the Russians. Of course, their involvement speaks volumes about the sheer scale of Moscow's manpower losses. It's obvious that Putin is desperately trying to plug the gaps, as Russia's domestic recruitment and conscription efforts are failing to sustain the war. This makes the growing cooperation between Russia and North Korea far from the triumph Putin's propagandists might claim. No, this partnership reeks of desperation. Faced with battlefield attrition rates it can't match and an economy teetering under the weight of war, Moscow has turned to one of the few nations willing to defy sanctions openly. Speaking of Russia's economy, it also has "finished" written all over it, just like Putin's efforts in Ukraine. Sure, on paper this economy might look solid. Russia's gross domestic product, GDP, is growing. Unemployment has hit a historic low of 2.4% and wages have skyrocketed. But this rosy picture hides severe structural problems, driven by the so-called military Keynesianism, an unsustainable, war-fueled economic boost. The defense industry alone has absorbed 500,000 workers, while the armed forces require 30,000 fresh recruits each month to replace casualties. The labor market is so strained that defense firms have had to increase wages fivefold, pushing inflation to 8.68% as of October. These increased wages might attract workers, but they still come at a steep cost. Other sectors, particularly those vital to the civilian economy, are suffering from acute labor shortages. Meanwhile, Moscow's lavish military bonuses have created a financial black hole that the civilian economy simply can't fill. Perhaps that's why the Kremlin has resorted to one of its most cynical moves yet, slashing compensation for wounded soldiers. In a November 13th decree signed by Putin, Russia introduced a sliding scale for injury payouts, cutting what was once a flat payment of roughly $30,000 for any injury to a drastically reduced amount based on the severity of the wounds. Under the new system, only soldiers with the most catastrophic injuries, classified as Section 1 and including severe spinal damage, brain trauma, or life-threatening organ damage, will receive the full $30,000 or 3 million rubles. For less severe but still debilitating injuries such as concussions or gunshot wounds not affecting organs, the payout drops to 1 million rubles or $10,000. And for truly minor injuries, soldiers will receive a paltry 100,000 rubles or roughly $1,000, barely enough to cover basic medical treatment. This cost-cutting measure is a flagrant betrayal of the soldiers who have already paid an immense price for Putin's war. Soldiers suffering from fractures or other injuries that may have long-lasting impacts on their lives are now treated as though their suffering doesn't matter. What was once a gesture of recognition for the hardships of war is now reduced to a cold, calculated formula. But the real sting comes when you consider the financial realities in Russia. With the rising inflation rate of 8% to 8.68%, even the 100,000 rubles for minor injuries will quickly lose their value. This means that the soldiers won't even be taken care of in the short term, let alone in the long run. For many, this is a painful reminder that they are seen as nothing more than expendable resources. However, for Russia, this miserly move was the only viable option, as the war's costs spiral out of control. A 2024 analysis estimated that casualty payouts alone could amount to 2.3 trillion rubles, which is equivalent to $26 billion. That's roughly 6% of the entire national budget. Faced with this financial hemorrhaging, Moscow is choosing to save rubles at the expense of the very people it sent to fight its war. But it gets worse. While the Kremlin trims compensation for injured troops, it continues to pour money into military bonuses. Lavish signing bonuses are swallowing resources that could otherwise be used to support those injured in service. Basically, Putin is sending a clear message to his people. You'll be paid handsomely to join, but once you leave, you're on your own. That's if you even get to leave. With this in mind, it's no wonder that morale has hit an all-time low among the Russian ranks. But unsurprisingly, Putin doesn't care. He's reportedly ordered the retake of Kursk at all costs. There's even a deadline for recapturing full control over the region, February 1st, 2025. That's not even 2 weeks after the newly re-elected US President Donald Trump is set to be sworn into office. While the deadline was reportedly set up before Trump was re-elected, we can't help but wonder about the peculiar timing. With no regard for the lives of his soldiers, Putin is launching his forces forward with the same reckless abandon as at the start of the war. Column after column of Russian vehicles are pushing forward, charging headfirst into Ukraine's prepared defensive positions, despite the significant losses and strategic setbacks. So why the rush? Well, Putin is clearly trying to grab as much negotiating leverage as possible ahead of any potential diplomatic overture to the new US president. By regaining this territory, he will be able to present a victory of sorts to Trump, or at least a strong negotiating position to secure a deal that could be seen as a win for Moscow. But as you've already heard in this video, this all-out push isn't exactly going according to plan. And now, while President Joe Biden is still in office, the US has thrown a major wrench into Russia's plans. He's given Ukraine an all-clear to use US-supplied long-range missiles on Russian soil. This decision marks a monumental shift in the dynamics of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Biden's move, taken on November 17th, followed months of Ukrainian pleas for more potent weapons to strike Russian infrastructure and military targets beyond the front lines. At first, the US resisted providing such weapons for fear of escalating the conflict. However, Moscow's provocative actions, especially the deployment of North Korean soldiers among the 50,000 troops in Kursk, finally prompted a change in Washington's stance. The immediate impact of this policy change was felt just 2 days later, on November 19th, when Ukrainian forces reportedly launched an ATACMS missile against a key Russian munitions storage facility in Karachev, Bryansk Oblast. This attack marked the first time that the US-supplied long-range missiles were used on Russian soil. The target, a vital arsenal of Russia's main missile and artillery directorate, was reportedly destroyed in a dramatic explosion that sent fireballs soaring into the sky. Residents even captured the moment on video, showing the scale of the blast that rocked the region. Ukrainian officials confirmed that the munitions stored at this facility included artillery ammunition and anti-aircraft missiles, which are critical supplies for Russia's ongoing offensive. But why is this strike seen as a turning point in the war? Well, the ATACMS, with a range of up to 190 miles, allows Ukraine to target high-value Russian assets far from the front lines. The weapon's precision and capability to strike so deep within Russian territory will undoubtedly put immense pressure on Moscow's military infrastructure. However, it's important to note that this isn't just about military targets. It's about crippling Russia's ability to resupply its forces and sustain operations across multiple fronts, and this strike is just the beginning. The US decision has allowed Ukraine to incorporate long-range capabilities from other NATO allies, including France and the UK, into its arsenal. These nations are now preparing to send their own long-range missiles to Ukraine, which notably include the Storm Shadow missiles, with a range of 310 miles. These missiles are designed to be launched from fighter jets, further increasing the diversity and reach of Ukraine's strikes within Russian territory. Other NATO allies are likely to follow suit. This means that Russia, which had become accustomed to operating with relative impunity on its own soil, will now be vulnerable to direct attacks that can cripple its logistics, command centers, and military resources. For Putin, this represents a nightmare scenario, a war on two fronts, one in Ukraine and one within his own borders. Moscow's response to this new reality has been predictably hostile. Russian officials, including Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov, have described the US decision as a dangerous escalation and a new phase of direct US involvement in the conflict. Peskov even warned that this would lead to greater tension between Russia and the West. As for Putin, he did what he does best: resort to the good old nuclear saber-rattling. This time, he dramatically lowered Russia's threshold for using nuclear weapons. Previously, Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed for the use of nuclear weapons only in case of a nuclear attack or an existential conventional attack, one that threatened the very survival of the state. However, the new doctrine now states that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons to any critical threat to its sovereignty and territorial integrity, even if the threat comes in the form of a conventional attack. This also includes situations where Russia's ally Belarus is attacked, or if a non-nuclear power, with support from a nuclear-armed state, engages in acts of war against Russia. Essentially, any attack by a NATO member or a joint attack involving NATO support could be deemed as an attack on Russia itself, thereby triggering the potential use of nuclear weapons. Of course, the timing of this decree is no coincidence. Putin wanted to make it clear that he views Biden's decision as a direct threat to Russia's security. The Kremlin has long warned that if NATO provided Ukraine with weapons capable of reaching Russian territory, it would consider NATO's involvement in the conflict as direct. In response, Russia wouldn't hesitate to escalate the situation. However, these repeated threats have always been just that, threats, empty words. This makes Putin's reaction just another desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control over a situation that has increasingly slipped from his grasp. But unless nuclear weapons truly enter the game, Russia is, as it stands, finished. It's losing troops, equipment, and money at an unprecedented rate. Now, with the capability for long-range strikes in Ukrainian hands, it will also lose territory and infrastructure. In other words, it's truly game over. But what do you think? Is Russia truly done, or will it find a way to turn the tide? Will the West continue to provide the necessary support to Ukraine, or will the recent changes in the US leadership begin to fracture the coalition? In June 2024, Putin visited Pyongyang for the first time in 24 years. He and Kim Jong-un exchanged gifts, including limousines and, naturally, artwork depicting Putin. The two countries signed a new strategic partnership that included a mutual defense agreement. But amidst the pomp, Putin was coming cap in hand, as he's likely set to make vital economic and technological concessions to the North Koreans he didn't have as much regard for in the past. These events would not have come to fruition if Putin's military were doing better in Ukraine. A little over 2 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. Why did the world's supposedly second most capable military get desperate enough to the point that Russia is now throwing itself into the arms of North Korea? Like many around the world, Putin believed in his military's own hype. He believed Ukraine would fall within days and the rest of the world would just have to deal with it. Instead, he has found himself in an environment that resembles World War I, where making incremental gains at high cost over multiple years is seen as a success. The Russian military has paid dearly in Ukraine. As of June 2024, it's lost over 3,100 tanks, 1,400 armored fighting vehicles, 457 armored personnel carriers, 280 command posts and communication stations, 376 towed artillery pieces, 383 MLRS units, 137 helicopters, 118 aircraft, and 26 ships and submarines, among others. These figures are from Oryx and are considered an undercount because they are only the visually confirmed losses. The latest casualty figures are even grimmer. British sources estimate that 450,000 Russians have become casualties in Ukraine, with more than 50,000 deaths. French sources believe the Russians have suffered 150,000 killed. Ukraine estimates that Russia has suffered 550,000 casualties. According to a collaboration between the BBC and Mediazona, an independent Russian source, the Wagner Group suffered 20,000 deaths in the Battle of Bakhmut. 88% of the deaths were the convict soldiers Russia had been forced into recruiting when the regular army suffered dramatic reversals in the second half of 2022. Maybe it shouldn't be surprising that Putin has had recruiting troubles of late. Russia needs new men to continue its current offensive. So far, Putin has avoided issuing another mobilization order. He doesn't want to draft people from Russia's European heartland, because this would expose the country's more influential cohorts to the cost of the war. But the supply of manpower might be running a little short in Siberia. The solution? According to Ukrainian and British intelligence sources, Putin is enlisting mercenaries from Africa to meet his manpower needs. He's reportedly offering a $2,000 sign-up bonus, a $2,200 monthly salary, and the promise of a Russian passport. Recruitment efforts are mainly focusing on men from Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and Uganda. These countries are poor, and the money the Russians are promising is an enticement to the people there, as it's much more than they can normally be expected to earn. However, any men that come over aren't expected to live long enough to enjoy it, so maybe the Kremlin thinks no harm, no foul. Russia has also suffered ammunition shortages. At one point in the war, Russian gunners were firing 60,000 artillery shells per day, but this quickly depleted their country's stockpile. By late 2023, Russia could fire only 10,000 shells a day, which was roughly equal to Ukraine before its shell hunger set in. The Kremlin estimated that in late 2023, it would need to produce 3 million shells per year to win the war, or about 15,000 per day. At the beginning of this year, that was 5,000 more shells than Russia was firing in Ukraine every day, and 9,000 more than its industry could produce per day.
In other words, Russia has gone to North Korea for assistance in this area not because it wanted to, but because it needed to. Why did the Russian military get into such a quagmire? Why couldn't it get the job done quickly against a force that it outnumbered and outgunned? The answer is that a military requires a lot of things to work in harmony behind the scenes in order to function effectively, and the Russian armed forces lacked much of it. Putin believing his military's own hype is the biggest reason why Russia got into this position. Intelligence failures have abounded in Ukraine from before the war to the present, which is ironic because Putin himself is a KGB man. The Federal Security Bureau, or FSB, which is responsible for internal security and also specializes in espionage in former Soviet states, failed to anticipate the resistance Russia would get in Ukraine, even as its unit for Ukrainian affairs swelled in size and even as contradictory information came in before the invasion. For example, the FSB took polls of the population and found that large segments were prepared to resist an invasion. However, the spooks either ignored this or failed to absorb the information, so the Kremlin kept getting favorable reports. The idea that the Ukrainian population would greet the Russians as liberators came from the FSB, which was good enough for them, perhaps, because it was exactly what Putin wanted to hear. However, this miscalculation was far from the FSB's only failure. The idea that Russian paratroopers could create an air corridor by seizing airports and flying reinforcements also originated with the FSB. In fact, Ukrainian intelligence detected joint planning between the FSB and Russia's paratroopers, a level of interaction that was unusual. FSB agents were also spotted at Hostomel Airport shortly before the invasion. However, this intelligence also proved inadequate. Ukrainian resistance prevented Hostomel from falling. The FSB not only underestimated Ukraine's capacity to resist and overestimated how well Russian paratroopers could defend the airport in the time heavier reinforcements were supposed to arrive, it also underestimated Ukraine's air defenses. None of Russia's air corridors were established. What makes things even worse for the FSB is that Ukraine's security services were supposed to have been heavily infiltrated by Russian spies. However, Ukraine in fact went on a dedicated reordering of its intelligence services, notably of the SBU, its main internal security division, with the help of Western agencies like the CIA and MI6. The purge was so extensive that Zelensky even removed the leader of the SBU, Ivan Bakanov, from his post in July 2022, despite his being a childhood friend. The more capable SBU has proven more than a match for Russia's spies. Putin's weak military doctrine is also to blame for many of the failures. Failure to use aviation adequately against Ukraine's air defenses has ensured that Russia still hasn't achieved air superiority despite its air force significantly outnumbering Ukraine's. Putin's failures in implementing combined arms doctrine have been a significant source of embarrassment. Without proper infantry and air support, Russian tanks were sitting ducks for ambushes, an outright disaster. This isn't the first time that Russia has faced such issues. During the Chechen wars of the 1990s and early 2000s, similar mistakes were made, but no lessons were learned. Unlike Russia, the United States adapted from its experiences in the War on Terror. American tactics involved turning tanks toward the direction of an ambush, utilizing the thick frontal armor to withstand attacks, while infantry suppressed the ambush. In stark contrast, Russian tanks in Ukraine stopped and retreated when ambushed, lacking any infantry support. This tactic led to tank columns grinding to a halt in the war's early days and has contributed to the ongoing high attrition rates of Russian tanks. But the blunders don't stop with tanks. At the core of Putin's failures lies sheer incompetence. This incompetence has been a critical factor in why Russia couldn't achieve a swift victory and continues to struggle, advancing only at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. One of the simplest reasons the Russian military has suffered so much is because of a lack of proper maintenance of its mechanized assets. Thousands of Russian vehicles have been lost due to abandonment or capture rather than destruction or damage. Before the war, the Russians neglected to tend to even the most basic maintenance tasks, like ensuring that there were spare parts available for repairs. In the early days of the war, there was such a shortage of spare parts that in some instances, Russian soldiers needed to loot Ukrainian junkyards to find the parts to keep their vehicles in proper repair. In what may be the worst case of neglect, the Russians failed to rotate their military vehicles when they were parked in storage in the build-up to the war. Competent militaries understand that these vehicles must be rotated from time to time to prevent the sun from damaging the tires. Over time, the sun will break down the rubber of the tires exposed to it. The Russians didn't seem to comprehend this fact, and the end result was that many of their vehicles broke down and had to be abandoned. To make matters worse, the Russians equipped their vehicles with cheap Chinese-made tires before the war began. Specifically, these were the Yellow Sea YS-20 tires. Trent Telenko, a former quality auditor for the US Army's tactical vehicles, called this tire a bad copy of the Michelin XZL military tire. These Chinese tires are ill-equipped to carry loads as heavy as the Russian vehicles demand. But the Russian military had a higher budget that could have purchased better quality tires. Where did the difference go? Into the pockets of corrupt Russian officers, of course, and we'll come to them in greater depth shortly. They figured the Chinese tires were good enough. Unfortunately for the Russians, they discovered that there was a high cost to those low prices when go time actually came. One wonders if China's People's Liberation Army is worried about how their tires might affect their own armored vehicles in the event of war. Poor maintenance extends to other aspects of Russia's military vehicles too. One major reason why so many tanks have been destroyed, especially early in the war, was due to the poor use of explosive reactive armor, ERA. This armor is designed to disrupt incoming projectiles like RPGs. When an anti-tank round impacts ERA, it explodes, setting them off before they can impact the main body of the tank. However, Russia had a poor record of equipping this armor to its tanks, stretching back to the wars in Chechnya. Things didn't change in Ukraine. 6 months after the invasion, the UK Ministry of Defense reported that Russian forces had failed to properly fit and employ adequate ERA to their tanks. It's highly likely that many Russian tank crews lacked the training to maintain ERA, leading to either poor fitting of the explosive elements or it being left off entirely. These deficiencies probably contribute to the widespread incidents of turret ejection, which are well documented in eyewitness videos from Ukraine. Corruption in a military leads to poor results on the battlefield. Any disruption to an armed force's supply chain will devastate it in the field long before the enemy does. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, Russian logistics officers are as much to blame for the staggering losses in Ukraine as the Ukrainians themselves are. The Russian logistics officers have been such good allies to Ukraine that in the opening phase of the war, Ukraine's National Agency on Corruption Prevention sent a thank you letter to Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense, for his generous cooperation in ensuring high levels of corruption among the officers that were supposed to be under his watch. Case in point, ERA panels are valuable to sell, and many Russian officers have been unable to resist the opportunity. In the early days of the war, Ukraine found that many of the Russian tanks it had captured were not equipped with ERA. Instead, the bags supposed to contain these panels were found with contents that looked like egg cartons. These were likely plastic fillers rather than egg cartons, designed to make sand inside the bags harder. Either way, the contents were not appropriate replacements for ERA and did little to protect the tanks against Ukraine's anti-tank weapons. Russia's problems distributing poor body armor are even worse than with adequately defending its tanks. Russian troops, especially the soldiers mobilized in late 2022, were not equipped with sufficient protection, which is partly to blame for so many of them dying or being maimed on the battlefield. Why was there such a problem? Partially because the bullet-resistant ceramic plates inside the modern body armor are valuable, and Russian logistics officers made a killing selling these as a side hustle. The body armor that Ukrainian forces later captured revealed that it was often lined with cardboard instead. Luckier soldiers got armor equipped with metal plates. Unfortunately for them, luck in this case is a relative term, because viral videos on social media revealed that Ukrainian soldiers could easily bend it over their knees. Pistol rounds easily penetrated the armor, let alone standard rifle rounds. Even worse off, Russian soldiers got airsoft body armor designed for paintball games. The problem goes deeper than body armor and applies to the most basic of items. It turns out that 1.5 million uniforms went missing too. These are also valuable resale items, and Russian officers decided other people could use them better than the troops under their command. And the Vanishing Act applies to much bigger equipment as well. You'd think a tank would be easy to track and hard to miss, but apparently not in Russia. Incompetence and corruption in the Russian military is so rife that thousands of modern T-72 and T-80 tanks that were supposed to be in storage have been cannibalized or sold off in pieces. The result, particularly in that critical first year of the war, was that Russia faced a shortage of modern tanks and needed to break out the more archaic tanks, like the supposedly retired T-62 and even 1950s-era T-54 or T-55 tanks. Without proper tanks and support vehicles, Russia's grand offensive stalled and reversed to the point that it lost thousands of square miles of territory. Putin's sheer incompetence has also extended to something as basic as providing security for a static convoy. Air defense systems were knocked out by Ukrainian airstrikes because the Russian soldiers nearby neglected to turn on their radars. It didn't help that Russian convoys were parked for so long because they lacked fuel. How does one of the world's leading energy-producing countries run out of fuel? The answer is that Russia simply lacked the number of trucks it needed to supply the convoys in Ukraine during the early days of the war, when the Russian military's effectiveness should have been at its height. The Russian military has instead relied, and still relies, heavily on its supporting rail network. Although the railroads are easy to repair even when Ukraine damages them, the problem is getting supplies from the railheads to where the combat is actually taking place. Russia had too few trucks on hand to do this, especially because the cheap Chinese tires ensured that many of them couldn't successfully complete the journey. Meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers made this logistical bottleneck worse for their enemy by deliberately targeting the trucks, over and above even tanks. Tanks needed to be refueled and their crews need to stay fed. Without those two things, even the best tank is useless. The Russian military also simply has chain of command issues. It's much more hierarchical than the US military. Instead of training junior officers to take the initiative with the support of a professional cadre of non-commissioned officers, the Russian military is top-heavy, relying on senior officers to make tactical decisions. This top-heavy structure ensures that the Russian military is slow to act while risking the lives of senior officers on the battlefield. By the end of 2023, 12 Russian generals were confirmed to have been killed in Ukraine. Why are so many Russian generals being killed? This is partly because of the excellent intelligence Ukraine and its allies have gathered, but it's also because the Russian generals don't trust their subordinates, and given the rampant corruption among them, it isn't hard to understand why. It's also simply difficult for Russia's senior officers to communicate with their subordinates, meaning that they need to take greater risks. Although the situation has gotten much better since the war began, in the early days, Russian troops were turning to unsecured civilian radios. To make matters even more embarrassing, Russian troops were unable to use their cryptophone system, once touted as the world's most secure communications channel, because it relies on 3G and 4G connections. The problem was that Russian troops destroyed the cell towers in the areas they occupied in Ukraine, as their superior officers neglected to inform them of the importance of those towers for their communications. Now, without their secure signals, the Ukrainians and their allies intercepted the unprotected communications, and when HIMARS came into play later in 2022, Ukraine was able to use the rockets to hit vital targets far away, all thanks to poor signal security in the Russian ranks. And even though Russia has been gaining ground this year, the cost of all these failures, even if they aren't as bad as before, are ballooning. Between January and April 2024, Russia sustained an estimated 82,870 casualties. This would lead to about 331,000 casualties total for the year if the trend continues. Since these figures come from Ukrainian sources, they may be an overestimate, as both sides have tended to overstate their effectiveness against their respective enemy throughout the war. However, even accounting for normal fluctuations, this pace would be far more than enough to kill or maim the 100,000 troops that the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense estimates will be needed to ensure a Ukrainian victory in the war of attrition sometime in 2025. It turns out that those cheap tires, poor maintenance, bad tactics, command incompetence, and the rampant corruption in the Russian ranks were critical components leading to the stalled convoys of the early days of the war. If Russia had taken better care of its vehicles and troops, its early offensives toward Kyiv and elsewhere might have met with more success, at a time when Ukraine was far less well-armed than it is now. Instead, Russia's incompetence and corruption guaranteed that it could not win the war at the time best suited for a decisive moment. Russia was instead forced to fight a costly war of attrition that saw it isolated from most of the world. And although some things have gotten better through the harsh lessons of the battlefield, the Russian military is still unwieldy and incompetent, relying on sheer mass for success. Now, to prevent a loss in the war of attrition, Russia has made itself more dependent on China, Iran, and even North Korea. Amidst the celebrations in Pyongyang, Putin might be thinking in the back of his mind, how did it come to this? If so, he should have started by looking in the mirror. What other reasons can you think of as to why it's come to this? What else is wrong with Russia's military?
Russia's invasion of Ukraine failed to produce the quick victory that Vladimir Putin and indeed the wider world expected. Kyiv did not fall in days, as everyone assumed. The Ukrainian government survived, but this should not be as surprising as it once seemed. The mistake of assuming a rapid, decisive victory is one that military leaders and warring states have made since ancient times. Sun Tzu cautioned leaders who thought of uncomplicated victories that the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities, and that there is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. Putin, like so many wannabe conquerors before him, failed to heed these warnings, and by March 2022 found himself in a prolonged war of attrition. No single decisive battle would end this war. Exhaustion from equipment losses and casualties would. It's now been over 2 years since the invasion began, and both sides have suffered from the latest instance of protracted warfare. But how many casualties have both sides taken since February 24, 2022? And how do these casualty figures tie into the ability of each of the warring countries to carry on the hostilities and walk away with a victory? First, it's helpful to remember that casualties do not equal people being killed in action. Casualties not only include those killed, but also wounded, captured, or missing. In 2021, Ukraine's population was about 44 million people. Russia's 2021 population was about 143.4 million, a figure 3.2 times as large. According to the Global Firepower Index, as of 2024, Ukraine has an available manpower of about 22 million, with 15.4 million fit for service and 476,000 reaching military age annually. Russia has 69.4 million, 46.4 million, and 1.2 million in each respective category. 2 years of war in Ukraine have produced hundreds of thousands of casualties in a combined total, but trying to determine more specific figures than that is a little trickier. For understandable reasons, both sides are reluctant to release their data. Looking at the size of the respective armies is a good way to start. Before Russia invaded, Ukraine had about 300,000 personnel between its regular armed forces and paramilitary troops. The war has swelled Ukraine's forces to about 2.2 million today, with an active duty force of 900,000. The rest are reserves and paramilitary forces, and not all of them are deployed at once. Russia, meanwhile, began the invasion with 190,000 troops. This was obviously not enough. By May 2023, after the partial mobilizations began, the number went up to 300,000, according to EU sources. By September, Russian forces in Ukraine had increased to 420,000, according to sources in Ukrainian intelligence. Russia's armed forces number 1.32 million active personnel, 2 million in reserve, and 250,000 paramilitary troops. Not all of these are deployed in Ukraine, as some of them need to patrol Russia's long borders, but more of the country's available troops have steadily been drawn in as the conflict continues. How many of these troops have become casualties? By June 2022, Ukraine reported that 10,000 of its men had been killed and an additional 30,000 injured. Russian losses were reported to be about 3 times that number. Accounting for overestimates, this is at least a reasonable idea because Ukraine was on the defensive as Russia attempted to sweep through the Donbas region. In September, Russia released figures supposedly showing that Ukraine had suffered 61,000 deaths and about 49,000 wounded, in comparison to about 50,000 Russian wounded and 10 times fewer casualties. These figures were plainly absurd, especially with Russian troops routing as Ukraine regained thousands of square kilometers of territory. 2023 brought more concrete, independent data. In August, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, PNAS, used 4,609 reports of military and civilian losses encompassing both sides and developed a statistical model to come up with a reasonably accurate estimate of each country's respective casualties. The authors tried to account for reporting biases on both sides. In particular, the study found that both sides overestimated the losses suffered by their respective opponents. Ukraine, they said, tends to magnify Russian deaths to twice what they actually are, while Russia estimated that Ukraine suffered 4 times as many fatalities as it actually did. PNAS also said that Russian sources underestimated their own casualty figures. The authors noted that Russia has suffered both more total casualties and a greater proportion of fatalities within its casualties, and Russian sources typically only report a third of the deaths their armed forces actually suffer. PNAS estimated that by February 2024, Ukraine had suffered about 17,200 fatalities and about 33,000 injuries. At this point, Russia was taking tens of thousands casualties in the months-long battle for Bakhmut. That same month, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that his forces had suffered 11,000 casualties in the battle, but Western officials said that between 20,000 and 30,000 Russian troops had become casualties there. These figures did not include the mercenaries from the then-active Wagner Group, which also suffered terrible losses in the battle, enough for it to rise in revolt against Moscow shortly after the city fell. Ukraine's garrison at Bakhmut had inflicted highly disproportionate casualties. But all was not well for Ukraine. As the Battle of Bakhmut raged, Ukraine was preparing for its counter-offensive in Zaporizhzhia. Western observers had high hopes for this operation and hoped that it would reach the Sea of Azov, cutting Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Unfortunately, Ukraine was unable to even come close to repeating the successes of 2022. The Ukrainian military wound up cracking the first 2 of Russia's 3 extensive defensive lines of Zaporizhzhia, but were unable to translate this momentum into a wider breakthrough. As Ukrainian forces flung themselves on the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since World War I, casualties naturally mounted. By August 2023, as the campaign in Zaporizhzhia raged, American sources estimated that Ukraine's casualties ballooned to a number between 100,000 and 120,000 injuries and 70,000 dead. Curiously though, Russia is regarded as having taken more casualties in this campaign than Ukraine, despite being on the defensive. In September, the Institute for the Study of War noted that Russia's Storm Z detachments with convict recruits had arrived to act as cover for units in the regular army, such as the airborne forces. With these troops being treated as cannon fodder, Russia was suffering hundreds of casualties per day, even as the Ukrainian offensive was failing to make strategic gains. With costly human wave tactics harkening back to many past wars, it should not be surprising that Russia has suffered far more fatalities than it officially reports. In June 2022, Russian sources claimed that they had suffered about 5,900 fatalities since the war began, but British intelligence sources estimated it to be nearly 3 times that, at roughly 15,000, and Ukrainian sources claimed it was over 30. Given the biases that PNAS mentioned, the British figure is likely the most trustworthy for that point in the war. By February 2023, PNAS's estimate for Russian casualties was roughly 150,000 injuries and almost 70,000 fatalities. In August, after the Russians had captured Bakhmut at an enormous cost and were suffering during Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia campaign, American intelligence sources estimated that Russia had suffered 120,000 fatalities during the course of the war, with an additional 170,000 to 180,000 injured. This would seem like a high proportion of deaths compared to the total casualties, and given their source, may be less than trustworthy compared to another figure released 2 months later. An independent investigation by the BBC and Mediazona, an anti-Putin Russian news outlet, used data from Russian cemeteries to conduct a statistical analysis. Through this study, they estimated that Russia had suffered at least 88,000 fatalities since the war started. A month later, a Ukrainian army official claimed on Facebook that Russia had suffered 170,000 injuries and over 150,000 deaths. The BBC Mediazona study is likely the closest to the truth. By March 2024, the British Ministry of Defence claimed that Russia had suffered 355,000 total casualties in the 2 years' war, amounting to about 983 per day. 2 months earlier, British officials predicted that Russia would suffer over 500,000 total casualties by the end of 2024. But these are military casualties only. Civilians have typically suffered the worst in war. Has it been the same this time? Russia has ignored the international humanitarian treaties that it's signed onto and attacked Ukrainian civilian population centers. Civilians in Russian-occupied areas have suffered even worse. In September 2022, UN sources estimated that there were 18,500 civilian injuries and 10,000 deaths in Ukraine. This would be a low ratio of civilian to military losses in historical wars. The UN said that the true figures could be much higher due to verification issues. Many of these casualties came during the siege of Mariupol that lasted between February and May 2022. Ukrainian sources claim that 25,000 civilians died there, although they would have wanted to magnify this number as part of the information warfare environment against Russia. UN sources confirmed 1,350 such deaths, but naturally estimated the number to be significantly higher. In January 2022, the city had a population of about 425,600 people. By May 2023, it had dropped to about 120,000, with the Institute for the Study of War citing Russian documentary evidence that plans were in place to ethnically cleanse the Ukrainian people there and replace them with Russians. UN sources claimed that 500 civilian deaths and 1,047 injuries were of children. Given that Russia has been known to attack at least one school in Kharkiv with cluster bombs, an unambiguous war crime that resulted in the death of a child, this is likely an undercount. Cluster bombs often fail to detonate, with Russian bombs in particular having dud rates as high as 40%. These unexploded bombs in effect become landmines. This is why it should not be surprising that at least 303 of those civilian deaths and 676 injuries came from mines and abandoned explosives. Ukraine has since become the most heavily mined country in the world, and more civilians have undoubtedly been accidentally killed by these. The February 2023 PNAS study claimed that 13,000 Ukrainian civilians had died and about 19,000 had been injured. In February 2024, the UN released a new estimate, verifying 30,457 civilian casualties, with close to 11,000 killed and 20,000 injured. In a total war of attrition, inflicting civilian casualties helps to cripple the enemy economy by depriving it of labor and productive capacity. This was the case during World War II, and like in so many other ways, the Russian military seems to be taking this approach to the treatment of civilians in Ukraine, despite international humanitarian law. Since the war has mostly been fought on Ukrainian territory, Russia has suffered few civilian casualties. However, it's not escaped unscathed. Cross-border raids, such as the one in Belgorod in May 2023, and missile drone strikes have left their marks. By August 2023, 7x7, another Russian independent media source, estimated that there had been 105 civilian casualties. These were concentrated near the border with Ukraine. While wounded men can sometimes return to action, this is often not the case. By December 2023, at least 20,000 of Ukraine's wounded had required amputations, and according to a Russian source, that was perhaps being unusually honest. Over half of all the wounded Russian soldiers required amputation. Tens of thousands of troops are also suffering from mental health issues. Lack of adequate rotation, especially in the Russian lines, has led to a full-blown mental health crisis. Abuse of alcohol and other drugs is common. Although the reports vary, the conclusion seems inescapable that Russia has not only suffered more casualties than Ukraine, but at a disproportionate rate. However, because Russia has a significantly larger population, it can still more easily afford its casualties than Ukraine, since they are far more easily replaceable. There are additional problems for Ukraine in mobilizing its people to fight this war. Much of the population has become refugees since the invasion started. 8 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced between February and May 2022. An additional 8 million fled the country by the war's first anniversary. That amounts to 37% of the country's pre-war population. Although most of these refugees have been women and children who are either unfit for military service or are not fit for all tasks, experts estimate that at least 20,000 Ukrainian men fled to avoid being drafted. The situation seemed to improve for Ukraine by the end of 2022, as some of the refugees returned home, with the figures dropping down to 5.1 million internally displaced persons and 6.3 million Ukrainian refugees living abroad. Ukraine's successful counteroffensives drew some people back. However, the war has turned against Ukraine since then. There is a darker side to this population flow. About 1 million Ukrainian nationals have forcibly been deported to Russia. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which Russia has ratified, prohibits this, and so this practice is considered a war crime. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for some Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin, for this behavior. However, Ukraine is not the only one suffering a loss of available manpower through refugees. Russia has also suffered, and disproportionately, in the prime military demographic. When Vladimir Putin announced his partial mobilization in the autumn of 2022, hundreds of thousands of men left the country to avoid conscription. These people are often some of Russia's best and brightest, who contribute disproportionately to its economy. Between 800,000 and 900,000 total people have fled Russia since the start of the war. At least 250,000 men are among those refugees. These are all people that cannot be called on to do any military service, and their no longer being available is important for Ukraine, as it amounts to Russia essentially losing a year's worth of replacements for its soldiers. This is crucial if it wants to win the war of attrition. Nevertheless, Ukraine is suffering a much worse shortage of manpower, which is why the country's draft laws have been changed. In April 2024, the Ukrainian parliament passed a new law that made more people eligible for conscription. Ordinarily, Ukrainian men over the age of 27 had been subject to conscription upon the declaration of martial law. The legislature has since lowered the age to 25, but the law went further than broadening the draft pool. Ukraine's brass had complained that not enough troops are showing up to camp. Draft dodging has become common. As in most wars of this nature, the initial swell of patriotism has since given in to gloom as the cost of the conflict has revealed itself. Troops are no longer so eager to fight. To crack down on draft dodging, the new law requires men to update their conscription data with the authorities within 60 days. Draft dodging now also comes with stricter penalties. A proposal to insert time limits for mobilization was dropped, and military service remains open-ended. However, there are also new incentives. Volunteers now get more pay. The Ukrainian parliament has also loosened recruitment rules in another way. In a sign of the increasing pressure Ukraine is under, the new law takes a page out of Russia's playbook and permits convicts to join the army under some conditions. Women are still not required to serve, but earlier legislation expanded the number of professions in which they were mandated to register. Previously, only women serving in specialized roles such as medicine were required to register for military service. Now women in professions as varied as journalism and music can be mobilized if wartime conditions demand it. So far, women have not been forcibly mobilized, but as pressure mounts, that could change. These new measures inspired fierce opposition among the war-weary Ukrainian public, but casualties in the 2 years of fighting have taken their toll, and the military needs replacements. Ukraine's brass, such as General Yuri Sodol, who commands the forces in Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblasts, lamented that he lacked manpower, with the Russian invaders outnumbering his troops by 7 to 10 times. This is not a winning formula in a war of attrition, even as Ukraine continues to inflict disproportionate casualties on Russian troops. Acknowledging that attrition, and not a decisive battle, would be key to winning this war, the Estonian Ministry of Defense claimed in December 2023 that Russia would need to kill or maim at least an additional 100,000 troops in 2024 in order for victory to be possible. The Estonians warned, if undisrupted, Russia has the capacity to train approximately 130,000 troops every 6 months into cohered units and formations available for launching operations. This would lead to 260,000 new troops available per year, which in turn can sustain a total force of 420,000 troops in Ukraine. The Estonians said that Ukraine must increase the demand for Russian manpower to the point that Moscow cuts corners with its basic training and sends increasingly worthless replacements to the battlefield. These troops will die faster, leading to a feedback loop of Russia becoming increasingly desperate for manpower as the war spirals into an unsustainable cycle. To do this effectively, Ukraine must also mitigate its losses. The Estonians estimated that Ukraine suffered a total of 200,000 casualties just shy of the war's second anniversary. They recommended that Ukraine's Western allies help it to mitigate these casualties by providing better training to Ukrainian recruits. Over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained by its Western allies. However, the Estonians reported that this training was not to the same quality. For example, basic training in the US Army is 10 weeks, followed by months of additional training for specialized tasks. Ukrainian troops have only gotten 5 weeks in basic and presumably far less for specialized tasks. It's time for us to set new objectives, a new pace, a new standard of quality in training, the Estonians concluded. This strategy of increasing Ukraine's lethality while training its soldiers to higher standards will require time though, time that Russia believes it has on its side. Ukraine has suffered severe shortages of ammunition in the first half of 2024 as Western aid slowed down. Aid picked up in the spring, with millions of shells and other vital ammunition set to arrive this summer. These packages should take Ukraine at least into 2025. Ukraine already killed or maimed well over 100,000 Russian troops in the first 2 years of the war. With such tools on hand, it's in a good position to meet the benchmark the Estonians have set for it, but difficulties have been multiplying. The British general Sir Richard Barrons warned in an interview with the BBC that a major Russian offensive looked to be coming this summer, which he thinks will be in Donbass and potentially toward Kharkiv. In April, General Christopher Cavoli, the senior American commander in Europe, warned that Ukraine would need significantly more aid and ammunition. Such aid is now arriving, and with stubborn Russian human wave tactics, the new shells, missiles, and later in the year F-16s should give Ukraine the means to inflict the 100,000 deaths and permanent injuries the Estonians believe will be necessary. Only time will tell if the war takes a turn for the better and Ukraine can use its new weapons to inflict the casualties it supposedly needs to. But one thing about the casualties in the fighting is clear. War may be a highly emotional matter, inspiring works of art and the consciousness of nations for thousands of years, but to the generals, it's often only a matter of math. What do the casualties in Ukraine reveal about the state of the war and the prospect for both sides? Will Ukraine be able to inflict the necessary casualties on Russia as its so-called shell hunger ends this summer? We have assessed over the course of the last couple of months that Russia has almost completely reconstituted militarily. Those are the words delivered by the US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell during a Center for a New American Security event in April 2024. During the event, Campbell claimed that China had played a large role in helping Russia to circumvent the military and economic setbacks it had experienced since it began its special military operation in Ukraine. An anonymous official backs Campbell's claims, saying that China has helped Russia to rebuild the industrial base of its defense sector, essentially filling the gap left by Russia losing its European trade partners in the process. More pressure is being placed on Ukraine. That's demonstrated by the fact that Kyiv lowered the draft age for young males from 27 to 25 in April 2024, showing that Ukraine is trying to shore up the many losses it's experienced on the front line. If all of this is true, then Russia's army must be in a strong position. It's reconstituted, meaning it's back to the power it had when it first launched the invasion, and it's ready to build more munitions to keep its war in Ukraine going for as long as needed. But there's a problem. Campbell's voice is one of the very few making this claim. He's contradicted not only the Pentagon and its assessments, but those of many of America's European NATO allies, all of whom are saying the same thing. Russia's army is weakening by the month and may even be on the verge of collapse. So which viewpoint is right? Has Russia rebuilt its army's strength, or is it being forced to watch as that army is slowly destroyed by Vladimir Putin's special military operation?
To answer that question, we need to examine the evidence that Russia's army is on the brink of collapse, starting with the manpower issue. For basic statistics, we can turn to global firepower, or GFP. Each year, GFP analyzes 145 military nations using over 60 data points to determine each country's strength. From there, it creates what it calls a power index score, with the perfect military being one that achieves a score of 0.0000. Russia isn't far away from that score, notching a 0.0702 power index in 2024, placing it as the second most powerful military nation in the world. Manpower is one of the factors that GFP considers when creating its ratings. Russia seems to be in a good position on that front. As of July 2024, GFP says it has a population of about 141.6 million people, over 69 million of whom are considered available manpower. Of that 69 million people, 46.4 million are fit for service, with a further 1.275 million people reaching military age annually. As for the current military, Russia has 1.32 million active personnel, placing it fifth in the world, along with 2 million reservists. Add paramilitary forces such as the various mercenary groups that have been involved in the Ukraine war, and you can add another 250,000 people to Russia's ranks. All looks well on the surface. Russia's military has millions of active and reserve personnel, with Putin also having the option to train millions more. So if that's the case, how could Russia possibly have manpower issues in its army? The answer starts with the losses Russia has suffered so far in Ukraine. Estimates vary depending on the source used. For instance, the BBC provided a conservative estimate of around 50,000 soldiers confirmed dead as of April 2024. The confirmed dead caveat is important here, as many other sources report the volume of Russian losses to be much higher when accounting for unconfirmed dead, abandonment and injuries that take soldiers out of commission. One of the sources is Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, or Minfin, which maintains a running tracker of Russia's military losses since the beginning of the war. Its numbers are far more worrying for Putin. Minfin claims that Russia has lost about 550,000 people between the war's beginning and June 30, 2024. There are also major equipment losses to consider during this period. Over 8,000 tanks, 15,000 armored vehicles, and 14,800 artillery systems have fallen to Ukraine's defenses, painting a picture in which Russia is losing men and weapons constantly. Of course, it's important to note that there may be an element of bias in Minfin's figures. After all, it's a Ukrainian government agency with a vested interest in making Russia look as weak as possible. Russia's real losses may lie somewhere in the middle of BBC and Minfin's figures. But even if that's the case, the numbers showcase a severe problem for Putin. Though he's demonstrated a willingness to throw soldiers at what the BBC dubs a meat grinder of a war, the loss of so many has a detrimental effect on Russia's army. After all, among those potentially hundreds of thousands who are dead or injured will be many of Russia's combat veterans. As they exit the war, Russia may be forced to enlist more and more people who have limited experience that are essentially sent to the front lines to die, only to be replaced by even more inexperienced troops. Keep that point in mind. Still, we've already established that Russia appears to have plenty of available manpower. Even with such extensive losses, Putin's approach of simply throwing people at Ukraine until it runs out of ammunition could work. The problem is that the Kremlin wants to avoid a draft. That's according to Bloomberg, which notes that Russia is turning to hiring contract soldiers to bolster its army because Putin believes that enacting another draft will result in a mass exodus of people from the country. After all, that's what Russia experienced in 2022 when Russia drafted 300,000 soldiers in the fall of that year. Even that exodus may not stop Putin, with Ukraine claiming Russia's president is planning to draft a further 300,000 people at some point in 2024. Still, Putin knows that approach is unpopular, which is why he's relying so heavily on contract soldiers. So heavily, in fact, that Russia is trying to get Ukrainians to sign contracts to fight their own country. That's according to Radio Free Europe, which published an article in May 2024 in which it reported Russia making an intense effort to recruit male Ukrainian students in the occupied Luhansk region. One of those students, a 20-year-old who gave his name as Anton, says that recruiters are telling Ukraine's young men that if they sign a contract and don't get mobilized, they'll have a better chance of surviving the war. Russia hasn't been shy about its desire to rely on contract soldiers. The country's former defense minister Sergei Shoigu claimed in December 2023 that Russia had a target of having 745,000 contract personnel in its army by the end of 2024, with those numbers potentially being bolstered by another round of conscription to keep the number of active personnel somewhat consistent with the 1.32 million GFP claims Russia has. Perhaps these efforts are the reason why Secretary of State Kurt Campbell believes Russia is reconstituting its army. Again, that doesn't seem like Russia has a manpower issue, at least until you look into the nature of its contracting efforts. Riddle Russia digs deeper into the issue. The website, which was founded on the back of Winston Churchill's famous quote that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, is dedicated to trying to decode the country's complex and often secretive nature. It does so by bringing together a community of experts who attempt to analyze the information that comes out of Russia fairly and without bias. Its commentary on Russia's contracted soldier situation is extremely interesting. Riddle says that Russia announced plans in December 2022 to have at least 1.5 million people in its active armed forces by the end of 2026, with 695,000 of those being contracted soldiers. Since then, the plans have been revised multiple times, with the number of projected contracted soldiers dropping to 521,000 in 2023, before rising again to the 745,000 figure Shoigu claimed in December 2023. Through an analysis of contract data, Riddle found that contracting has been accelerating for at least a year. It says that the period between January and May 2023 saw Russia sign approximately 6,000 contracts per week with soldiers. That number jumped up to between 10,000 and 17,000 per week from May 2023 until the end of the year. The only explanation for this increase, Riddle claims, is that there's a clear bureaucratic campaign to achieve the targeted number no matter the cost to Russia. Why does all of this matter? There are two reasons. First, these figures suggest something is being skewed in the data Russia is putting out. Riddle notes that the most recent public data relating to contract soldiers in Russia comes from 2020, when the country had 405,000 contract soldiers in its army. Back then, Russia had a target of reaching 500,000 contract soldiers by 2027. It somehow managed to exceed that target now it's at war, at least according to official data, which doesn't quite add up. How has Russia managed to get more contract soldiers at a time when those soldiers know they're going to be sent into Ukraine to likely die than it managed to get when Russia was at peace and those soldiers had fewer issues preventing them from signing contracts? The second reason all of this matters offers an answer. Riddle notes that not only did Russia experience heavy losses during the first 6 months of the war, which were partially responsible for the mobilization that saw 300,000 people being drafted, but it also saw many soldiers' contracts come to an end. Those out-of-contract soldiers were likely kept on the front lines, having been swept up in Russia's mobilization efforts. That creates uncertainty in Russia's contracting numbers. Did those out-of-contract soldiers have their contracts extended indefinitely, or were they bumped down onto mobilized servicemen roles? It was likely the former, meaning a large portion, if not the majority, of the 490,000 contract soldiers Russia claimed to have in its army as of December 19, 2023, weren't newly contracted troops. Most were likely those who had their contracts extended indefinitely when the war broke out. The point? Russia is actually struggling far more to recruit contracted soldiers than its official figures suggest. This isn't to say that there are no new contract soldiers on the front lines, there are. However, Russia's claims to have significantly bolstered its forces in this area are spurious, according to Riddle, with suggestions abounding that many of those in the contracted forces are people who should have been out of the army but have had their contracts extended. There are other issues with Russia's figures. For instance, Riddle claims that Russia is boosting these numbers further by including both prisoners and those enlisted in what the country calls its volunteer formations. Pravda reported on these volunteer formations in June 2024, in which it noted that Russia's Ministry of Defense created a volunteer corps of 20,000 people that included mercenaries, reservists, and ex-cons. The problem is that these volunteer units aren't getting the support they need to be effective in Ukraine. That's according to analysts Pravda quoted who said, Russia's irregular formations are mainly light infantry units, which lack integrated artillery or air support, making them more brittle than Russia's regular formations. Consequently, during the last 9 months, Russian irregular units have likely sustained proportionally higher casualty rates than Russian regular units. What does all of this mean for Russia's army from a manpower perspective? Not only does Russia's army have fewer contracted soldiers than the official figures suggest, or at least fewer new contract soldiers, but many are simply not up to the standard required. The volunteer and inmate forces lack the level of support offered to Russia's main forces, meaning the army is still rich in numbers but increasingly devoid of tactics. Putin isn't strengthening Russia's army. He's simply adding more warm bodies in the hope that pouring manpower into the Ukrainian meat grinder will be enough for him to win the war. And that brings us to another problem Russia's army faces: a lack of morale. We see hints of Russia's morale problem by looking at the support for Putin's war in Russia itself. The general opinion formed by many in the West is that most Russians support the Ukraine war. A February 2024 report in the Kyiv Independent seems to back up this claim. It says that a poll found that 70% of Russians support the war versus just 16% who oppose it. Those types of figures have been mostly consistent since February 2022. A similar poll reported on by the Atlantic Council put the figure at 73% in November 2023. But digging into that poll demonstrates hints that the Russian appetite for the war is actually waning. For instance, when quizzed on whether they offered unquestioning backing for the war or simply supported it more than opposed it, 53% of Russians chose the latter option. That's a marked increase on the 39% who claimed they supported the war more than opposed it, ahead of fervently supporting the war in March 2022. A polling company named WCIOM offers even more insight. Its director, Valery Fedorov, said in September 2023 that their polling shows that only between 10% and 15% of Russia's population enthusiastically support Putin's special military operation. Fedorov commented, "The majority of Russians do not want to seize Kyiv or Odessa. If it was up to them whether to start the special military operation, they probably would not have done it." Add to this similar polls showing that between 50 and 60% of Russians reject the idea of a second wave of mobilization that would lead to hundreds of thousands of more people being conscripted, and a picture starts to emerge. Many Russians do not want this war. The distaste for conscription is one of the reasons why Putin is focusing so much on contract soldiers to supplement his army. But even taking that out of the equation, it's clear that the fervent support for the war that appeared present in its beginning is waning. Why does this matter? If Putin does use a second wave of conscription to bolster the Russian army's ranks, he's going to be pulling recruits from a pool of people who increasingly don't want to be part of his special military operation. And that just means we'll start hearing more stories about Russian soldiers deserting their posts. In May 2024, the Defense Post reported that Ukraine's military intelligence agency, or HUR, believes that around 18,000 Russian soldiers stationed in the southern military district have now deserted their posts. HUR claims that 12,000 of these soldiers come from Russia's 8th Combined Arms Army, with a further 2,500 deserting the 58th Combined Arms Army. Tellingly, around 50% of the deserters are believed to be conscripted soldiers, again highlighting a lack of appetite for Putin's war in Russia, with around 2,000 being contract soldiers. Other sources suggest desertions are rising as well. A February 2024 article published in Novaya Gazeta recounts statistics from a non-profit organization called Get Lost, which helps Russian soldiers escape conscription into the Ukraine war. Get Lost claims that desertions have increased tenfold in a year, noting that 28 soldiers contacted the group in January 2023, with that number being 284 in January 2024. All told, Get Lost says it's helped 2,000 Russians escape the army, with many more likely to follow. All of this is despite Russia having a severe 10-year prison penalty for desertion. Add the hundreds of thousands of Russians who have emigrated since the war began. The Economist placed the figure at between 817,000 and 922,000 people in August 2023, and it's becoming clearer that Putin has a manpower problem. Fewer and fewer Russians actually want to be part of the army, with those who have been conscripted being more likely to abandon their posts, while others simply get out of Russia before conscription can become a problem for them. Why might this signal the collapse of the Russian army in 2024? On the obvious level, a lack of appetite for war means that Russia has a harder time recruiting soldiers, which will inevitably lead to it relying on conscription again. Most Russians don't want that, and as the desertions from the southern military district showcase, thousands of conscripts are abandoning their posts. That raises another problem for Russia's army in that it will increasingly struggle to coordinate attacks against Ukrainian positions because it won't be able to rely on its units being as strong as they're supposed to be due to so many soldiers running away. The manpower problem is becoming so extensive that Russia is finding itself going to its allies for help. In a June 2024 article covering Putin's journey to North Korea to meet with President Kim Jong-un, The Standard, a UK-based newspaper, suggests that Putin is running into a manpower problem for which he will require North Korea's help. The problem is that Putin is struggling to fill support and security positions back home. Many who would have been in those positions are now on the Ukrainian front lines. Russia faces threats from Islamic extremists back home, with the most recent of those being a terrorist attack in the southern Republic of Dagestan that left 20 police officers and a priest dead. The Standard suggests that part of Putin's deal with Kim will see Russia fly in thousands of North Koreans to fill supporting roles, be it in security positions in Russia or in roles that enable Putin to pull more Russians into his army. That's a problem, both for Russia and its army. Again, the army is likely to see an influx of conscripts who don't want to be in Ukraine if this report is true. As for Russia itself, it would give North Korea more influence in its affairs, with Putin's willingness to enable that influence suggesting a leader who's in a desperate state. There's another problem all of these manpower issues cause for Russia's army. The standard of its troops varies widely from unit to unit. This problem was revealed as early as July 2022, with the Moscow Times reporting on a soldier who used the pseudonym Ivan when speaking about the training he'd received before the war. He was only given 5 days to learn how to be a soldier following his conscription, after which he was thrown out to the front lines. Speaking to the outlet, he claimed, "There was a soldier in our company who didn't know how a machine gun works. So I taught the guy how to disassemble and assemble a machine gun. I wouldn't want to be next to him in a battle. How can you fight like that?" How indeed.
The report goes on to claim that offering minimal training to recruits appears to be the standard in the Russian army, suggesting that Russia's previous training standards aren't being observed now that it's at war. The British Defense Ministry backed these claims in May 2023, stating that many of Russia's ground forces in Ukraine were poorly trained mobilized reservists, being forced to rely on old Soviet-era equipment when fighting. The outcome of this approach, claims the ministry, is that though Russia's combined group of forces numbers around 200,000 people, it's becoming increasingly incapable of conducting effective military operations around the front lines. Instead, we again see the strategy Putin is increasingly relied upon as Russia gets deeper into the war, throwing as many people as possible at Ukraine in the hope of overwhelming its forces. This approach was highlighted in the fighting for the Ukrainian fortress town of Avdiivka in February 2024. Though Russia eventually took the location, Ukrainian soldiers reported that there was an enormous variance in the quality of soldiers they encountered during the fighting. One Ukrainian who spoke to the Washington Post suggested that about a quarter of the Russian soldiers involved in the offensive seemed just confused about what they were supposed to be doing. There were some with little more than uniforms and basic rifles, while others had more advanced equipment, the soldier noted. Do you remember earlier in the video that we said to keep in mind Russia's veterans slowly being cycled out of the army as they're killed or their contract ends? This is the reason why. Losing so many thousands of its veterans in the war has forced the Russian army to increasingly rely on poorly trained conscripts and contracted soldiers who have no idea what they're doing on the battlefield. Not only is this approach having a clear impact in Ukraine, Russia's army is losing far more people than it should because of inconsistency and incoordination, but it will cause issues in the future. Should Russia win, it'll be left with an army that's essentially a mishmash of poorly trained conscripts, volunteers, and whatever few veterans remain. Next up, an issue we've touched on when mentioning the British Ministry of Defence's commentary on antiquated Russian equipment. Russia is struggling to keep its army stocked in 2024. Alexei Danilov made this clear in 2023 when speaking about Russia's weapons stockpiles. The Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Danilov, said, "Russia is running out of prepared stockpiles of weapons. Missiles and military equipment have been accumulating for decades. The calculations called for blitzkrieg, not blitz-utilization." In other words, the war was meant to be won quickly. When it wasn't, Russia's army was forced to drain its modern equipment stocks to the point where it's increasingly enforced to rely upon older and older equipment to maintain its offensives. The Moscow Times all but confirmed this situation around the same time that Danilov made his comments, with a report claiming that it had stopped a previously scheduled disposal of Soviet-era weapons due to the situation. Between 2014 and 2022, Russia spent around $100 million on contracts for the disposal of these old weapons. Those contracts stopped in January 2022, no more having been signed as Russia pulls its mothballed Soviet equipment from storage and sends it to the front. That creates even more problems for its army. One Russian contractor told the outlet that the old equipment being sent into Ukraine is in extremely poor condition thanks to being improperly stored. That's why the front line isn't moving, he said when speaking about the slow progress Russia has made in Ukraine. Come 2024, there are even more reports that Russia's army is being forced to use outdated equipment. In February 2024, Reuters reported on Russia's refitting older tanks after losing around 3,000 in Ukraine. The army has been forced to focus on a quantity over quality approach, much as it has with its manpower, to maintain pressure on Ukrainian positions. Another report by the BBC, also from February 2024, quoted a Western official who says that Russia's domestic ammunition capabilities are currently insufficient for meeting the needs of the Ukrainian conflict. Sanctions are hitting hard, claims the official, who notes that Russia's struggles to secure raw materials for its production facilities are causing delays. Putin's response? Build closer ties with other countries to keep the Russian army stocked. Iran has been a major supplier, at least according to several Reuters reports. In June 2023, the outlet quoted White House spokesperson John Kirby, who claimed that Russia has received hundreds of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, from Iran that it's now using to attack Ukraine. We're also concerned that Russia is working with Iran to produce Iranian UAVs from inside Russia, Kirby also claimed. That's good news in the short term for Russia's army, but it's again another insight into how Russia is struggling to keep its soldiers equipped during the war. Add a February 2024 Reuters article into the mix, in which the outlet noted that Iran has delivered around 400 ballistic missiles to Russia, and you see that reports of Russia's equipment running out are likely true. Its army is being forced to rely on weapons that Russia itself did not create. North Korea has also emerged as a key supplier, with a February 2024 report in Al Jazeera claiming that the country sent around 6,700 containers carrying over 3 million artillery shells to Russia in exchange for food. The two countries' presidents, Putin and Kim, have since signed a defensive pact that will likely see more North Korean armaments making their way to Russia as of June 2024. All of these trades point to a Russian army that isn't capable of keeping itself stocked.
As Riddle, the resource that earlier highlighted the contracted soldier problems in Russia's army, points out, any increased production coming out of Russia is a result of actions taken before the war started. Russia is burning through its stockpiles of raw materials at a rapid pace and can't replenish them quickly thanks to sanctions. Between 2010 and 21, the production and modernization of battle tanks in the country fell from 200 per month in the 2010s to fewer than 100 in 2021, a number that Russia is still failing to increase now the war is underway. In short, Russia may still be producing weapons for its army in 2024, but its capacity to do so is diminishing with each passing month, forcing it to rely on outside aid as its material stockpiles dwindle. Russia is coming up with short-term solutions to long-term problems within its army. Perhaps that's why May 2024 saw several officials close to Putin suggest that Russia's president wants to call a ceasefire to the war along its current front lines. That ceasefire might allow Putin to negotiate for an end to the war, with Russia keeping the territory it's already captured. It's practically impossible that Ukraine would accept such terms, but the very fact that Putin is second-guessing his army's ability to take the entire country suggests that he's aware of how close his forces are to collapsing in 2024. Beyond those calls for a ceasefire, Putin has also re-established the Leningrad and Moscow military districts, both to consolidate its position in Ukraine and prepare for a possible future conflict with NATO. These districts will do little to solve the wider problems in Russia's military. To recap, diminishing manpower combined with a lack of morale means the army is far less effective today than it was when the war in Ukraine began. Russia's army is quickly running out of equipment, meaning it's forced to use inadequate Soviet-era weapons, along with accepting help from other countries, in moves that could enhance those countries' influence within Russia in the years to come. But despite those problems, Russia's army isn't going to collapse to the point where it no longer exists. It may still even win the war in Ukraine because of Putin's willingness to throw any warm body he can get his hands on at his special military operation. Instead, the collapse will come in terms of Russia's ability to mount effective military operations with an army that's full of confused recruits, old equipment, and a continually diminishing stock of capable combat veterans. But what do you think? Is Russia's army close to collapsing in 2024? Or is Putin's approach fine as long as Russia keeps slowly gaining ground in Ukraine?
Until 2022, Russia was a proud owner of one of the largest and most powerful naval forces in the world. Sure, many of its hulls dated back to the Soviet era, but Russia's naval capabilities were still formidable and feared by many due to their sheer size and global reach. Then Russia made the fatal mistake of attacking Ukraine. Though this mistake has cost Russia and its president Vladimir Putin dearly across the board, politically, economically, and diplomatically, its navy has been hit particularly hard. Now, Russia's key naval assets are sidelined, the country's naval modernization plans are stalled, its operational capabilities are severely compromised, and worst of all, Russia is losing ships at an alarming rate. But this isn't the worst part for Russia. The worst part is that all of this is happening at the hands of a country that doesn't even have a proper fleet. Talk about irony. But how exactly is Russia running out of ships? Keep watching to find out. Only 2 short years ago, no one had faith that Ukraine could stand its ground against Russia's military might. Yet here we are, in 2024, as Ukraine's fierce resistance has proven all the skeptics wrong. Despite punching well above its weight, Ukraine has managed to not only defend its sovereignty, but also push back against Russian forces, demonstrating remarkable courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Russian naval forces were among the most formidable challenges Ukraine faced, but through innovative strategies, resourcefulness, and some international assistance, Ukraine has effectively contested Russian naval dominance in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. However, contested Russia's naval dominance might even be considered an understatement given how things are currently unfolding in the Black Sea. You want a hint? These newspaper headlines should paint quite a vivid picture. Ukraine has broken Russia's naval supremacy in the Black Sea. Ukraine is winning the war's Black Sea front. Ukraine has no navy, but it's hammering Russia in the Black Sea. It doesn't look too good for Russia, right? Even though these headlines are enough to underscore Ukraine's remarkable naval achievements in the Russo-Ukrainian War, a closer look at the events that inspired them will help you understand just how much trouble Russia is in. Let's go through a quick rundown of all the Russian vessels Ukrainian forces have managed to destroy or severely damage since the beginning of the invasion. March 22, 2022, a Russian Raptor-class vessel gets hit by a Ukrainian anti-tank guided missile, causing this high-speed coastal patrol boat to get swiftly towed away. March 24, 2022, an Alligator-class landing ship called Saratov, docked in Berdyansk, Ukraine, catches fire. Ukraine quickly claimed responsibility for the attack, reporting that it was carried out using short-range OTR-21 Tochka tactical ballistic missiles. For its part, Russia did report the ship to be towed from the area, but mentioned no details regarding the cause of the fire. Interestingly, the Russian Navy only had 3 of these Cold War-era ships in active service, so Ukraine's successful targeting of one of them represents a significant blow to Russia's naval capabilities in the region. In the following days, 2 other Russian ships, the Seyza-Kunikov and the Novocherkassk, docked nearby, also fled the area under similar circumstances, fire and smoke engulfing their decks. April 13, 2022, the day of one of Ukraine's biggest wins in the naval theater. The day the Slava-class guided missile cruiser named Moskva was taken out by the Ukrainian Navy. But what's so special about this ship? Well, the ship was the only flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, Russia's premier naval asset in the region. Moskva led the naval assault during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, playing a crucial role in the amphibious assault on Snake Island. Moskva was also considered one of the most powerful and iconic warships in the area, ultimately becoming the largest Soviet warship to be sunk since World War II. And in case you haven't put 2 and 2 together, Moskva was named after Russia's capital city Moscow, which added a symbolic layer to its destruction. The honor of carrying out this destruction belonged to 2 Neptune anti-ship missiles launched from the Crimean coast. At first, there was a massive explosion that engulfed Moskva in flames. However, the ship ultimately sank a day later while being towed away, as confirmed by Russian officials. The Moskva took at least 18 sailors down with it, with some reports claiming that the death toll was significantly higher. The first days of May 2022 brought no relief for the Russian Navy. 4 more Raptor-class patrol boats were eliminated, thanks to Ukrainian Bayraktar TB2 drones. Russia only had about 16 of these boats, meaning Ukraine managed to take out over 30% of them in a little over a month. Though to be fair, 3 of these boats were outright destroyed in the second attack, while the 4th was towed to Sevastopol for repairs. In the same attack, a BK-16 high-speed assault boat sank near Snake Island, one of 12 in Russia's naval arsenal. May 7, 2022, the Bayraktar TB2 drones continued to wreak havoc in the Black Sea. This time their target was a Cerner-class landing craft stationed on Snake Island. June 17, 2022, the Bayan M-class corvette named Veliki Ustyug, which previously participated in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is now being towed away across the Volga River in a less than desirable state. This corvette was part of the effort to modernize the Russian Navy, representing a massive upgrade of the original Bayan class built from 2004 onward. The vessel damaged by Ukraine was one of 20 in the Russian Navy's arsenal. On the same day, June 17th, Ukraine reported that it had sunk a Russian rescue tug built to tow ships in distress, supply water and electricity to other ships, evacuate injured personnel, and fight fires at sea. The ship, named Vasily Bek, was taken out by 2 Harpoon missiles Ukraine received from Denmark. October 29, 2022, Ukraine is back to raining fire with unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones. This time, the drones struck Natya-class minesweeper Ivan Golubets in Sevastopol, damaging the Soviet-era vessel used for ocean minesweeping. But this is far from the Ukrainian Navy's biggest hit on October 29th. During the Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol, the Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate named Admiral Makarov was struck with at least 1 drone, reportedly disabling its radar. Why is this hit notable? Because we're talking about the new flagship of the Black Sea Fleet post-Moskva's sinking. Plus, let's not forget that this vessel also took part in the invasion, launching cruise missiles at a Ukrainian oil refinery and fuel deposits in Odessa and terrorizing the local population. Though the Russian Navy claimed Admiral Makarov suffered only slight damage, the vessel was put out of commission until August 2023. That's 10 months of one of Russia's most advanced frigates being out of action, a massive win for Ukraine. August 4, 2023. The Security Service of Ukraine (SBU) and the Ukrainian Navy worked together to damage a Rapucha-class landing ship near the port of Novorossiysk, some 260 miles east of Sevastopol. The vessel, named Olenogorsky Gornyak, was one of the 15 Rapucha-class landing ships, the most important class available to the Russian Navy's service. It was on loan from the Northern Fleet at the time of the attack. Though Olenogorsky Gornyak wasn't sunk, it was severely damaged. However, even this was enough to cause a shift in the naval theater, as the Ukrainian Navy reported that Russian ships were leaving the port and dispersing in the Black Sea. September 13, 2023. Ukraine conducts a nighttime raid on Sevastopol. Ukrainian Sukhoi Su-24 supersonic all-weather tactical bombers took part in this raid, targeting an improved Kilo-class attack submarine Rostov-na-Donu and another Rapucha-class landing ship named Minsk. The vessels were hit by Storm Shadow missiles, visibly destroying Minsk and damaging Rostov-na-Donu beyond repair. Though the Russian government doesn't seem to agree with the beyond repair part, vowing to return both ships to full operational status. This certainly won't be easy, however, as the Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol also badly damaged the dry dock repairs facility in the city, further complicating Russia's efforts to repair its damaged naval assets. On the same day in the same attack, a Turnets-class patrol boat was sunk. September 24, 2023, Ukraine switches back to naval drones, damaging the Project 22160 patrol ship of the Russian Navy called SKYROCKET. But this attack only managed to damage the ship. The Ukrainian Navy got the job done on March 5, 2024, when the Magura V5 maritime drones sank SKYROCKET off the coast of Crimea. This was the third notable ship Ukraine managed to sink in 2024. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, not when the Ukrainian Navy managed to damage 2 more Russian vessels in 2023. The first was on November 4th. The Ukrainian forces used cruise missiles to strike the Zaliv shipbuilding yard in Kerch, Crimea. This attack damaged a brand new SKYROCKET-class corvette Askold armed with Caliber cruise missiles. The corvette, still in sea trials, was deemed a total loss following the November strike. December 26, 2023. Ukraine's Air Force launches Storm Shadow or Scalp cruise missiles that strike Novichokazk, a Rapucha-class landing ship docked in Feodosia, Crimea. Does the name sound familiar? It should, as this is the same landing ship that was targeted in the March 2022 attacks. Then it fled the scene with minimal damage. Now, if Ukrainian reports are to be believed, Novichokazk was no more. The Ukrainian attack seemingly detonated the munitions aboard the ship, leading to a massive explosion that reportedly claimed the lives of at least 33 of the 74 crew members. Taking out Novichokazk meant significantly impeding the Russian Navy's ability to further invade Ukraine's Black Sea coast, which made this attack a triumphant way to close out 2023. February 2024 ushered in a new chapter in the Russo-Ukrainian naval conflict, equally devastating for the Black Sea Fleet. February 1, 2024, one of 20 Tarantul-class corvettes, Ivanovets, is reportedly sunk in Donyaslav, Crimea, courtesy of the Magura V5 maritime drones. Just before it sank below the surface, stern up, the ship's magazine detonated, leading to a spectacular series of explosions, quite a send-off for the Ivanovets. February 14, 2024, Ukraine finishes off another vessel that was previously damaged in March 2022. The large Rapucha 1-class landing ship Sezarkunakov suffered the same fate as its fellow Novichokazk. The only difference is that it met its end at the hands of the Magura V5 drones, and that Russian sources actually confirmed its sinking. But given that Ukraine released a video showing the said sinking, it will be pretty hard to deny. And again, it's Russia we're talking about. Nothing is impossible. But back to the Ukrainian footage. The grainy black and white video shows a Magura V5 drone moving incredibly fast on the nighttime waves, so much so that it resembled a small speedboat. In a classic David vs. Goliath tale, this small speedboat strikes the nearly 370-foot-long behemoth, causing it to explode spectacularly. The video ends with Sezarkunakov rolling onto its port side before sinking with roughly 70 crew members aboard. The very next day, Putin reportedly sacked the Black Sea Fleet commander, Admiral Viktor Sokolov, replacing him with his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Sergei Pinchuk. Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy, will suffer the same fate about a month later, being replaced by the commander of the Northern Fleet, Admiral Alexander Musayev. Both of these moves are a direct result of the Ukrainian spectacular attacks on the Black Sea Fleet. March 23, 2024. A Ukrainian missile strike damages a Yuri Ivanov-class intelligence ship, Ivan Kurs, during an attack on the ports of Sevastopol. The same ship was previously targeted by Ukrainian drones in May 2023. 2 attacks on the same ship were no accident. In fact, Ukrainian forces have been outright hunting Ivan Kurs for nearly a year between the 2 attacks. Why? Because this 4,000-ton vessel is fitted with radar warning receivers and similar electronic eavesdropping devices that allows Russian forces to locate Ukraine's radars and missiles arrayed along the Black Sea coast. The same radars and missiles have been used to shoot down multiple Russian warplanes flying over the Black Sea and target warships sailing on it. So you can see why protecting this gear is in Ukraine's best interest. As long as Ivan Kurs is active, the Russian forces can essentially map out Ukraine's coastal forces, forestalling their hits. Since the second attack on the ship didn't sink it, it only inflicted damage, it's highly likely Ukraine will have another go at Ivan Kurs soon. April 21, 2024, the Kommuna, the oldest ship in the Russian Navy's service, is struck by an anti-ship missile in Sevastopol. The extent of the damage to the salvaged ship is still unknown. May 6, 2024, the Magura V-5 naval drones are at it again. This time, they destroyed a patrol boat, later identified as a $3 million worth Mangust-class vessel used for search and rescue and countering subversive operations. When you tally all these attacks up, it becomes clear why reports are claiming that the Ukrainian forces have taken out an impressive 25% of Russian vessels in the Black Sea. Not bad for a country without a proper navy, right? There are even reports that Russian ships are abandoning the Black Sea altogether, igniting hope that Ukraine could win back Crimea after 10 long years. According to Ukrainian captain Dmytro Pletenchuk, only one loser missile ship is currently left in the Black Sea. Ukraine owes these incredible results to the daring and innovative asymmetric campaign carried out against an opponent that might be stronger but is risk-averse and lacks imagination. It seems that the country is constantly inventing new ways to sink Russian ships, and evidently, it's been quite successful. But can't Russia just replace the vessels Ukraine takes out? After all, the country is famous for its robust military-industrial complex and vast resources. Correction, the country was known for these things. Following the invasion of Ukraine, Russia became fully mobilized, politically, industrially, and militarily. This all-out mobilization has come at a great cost, both metaphorically and literally. Simply put, the mobilization has depleted resources that the Kremlin can't renew. And remember, we're talking about naval vessels, not some disposable assets. Each vessel requires a significant investment of time and money, both things Russia is running out of. Even with simpler military equipment, such as shells and ammunition, the losses are outpacing new production. So what chances do new Russian vessels truly stand? Throw the fact that the current Russian shipbuilders are running out of key engine parts into the mix, and it becomes obvious that Russia's ability to replace lost vessels with new developments is nearly non-existent. But what about replacing lost vessels with existing ships? Couldn't Russia simply relocate existing ships from other fleets to replace those lost in combat? It could in theory, but in practice this plan has a major obstacle: Turkey. The invasion of Ukraine has severely impacted the dynamics in the Black Sea, giving Turkey significantly more power over the region. Invoking Article 19 of the Montreux Convention, an international agreement that governs the passage of vessels through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, Turkey closed its straits to the transit of military vehicles whose home base isn't in the Black Sea. In other words, no other Russian fleets can come to the Black Sea Fleet's rescue. US officials have praised this move as a major contribution to Ukraine's security. But is Ukraine's security the only reason Turkey opted for this move? Absolutely not. Turkey considers the Black Sea a region of vital strategic importance. This sea is crucial for the connectivity of energy pipelines, which have allowed the country to extract natural gas. Turkey also enjoys the evident shift of power in the Black Sea, as the country has long sought to assert itself as a key player in the region. This region has also served as the main theater of competition between Russia and Turkey throughout the years, so you can see why Turkey is reveling in the new developments. The more ships the Russian Black Sea Fleet loses, the more the country's naval supremacy in the area erodes. Of course, Turkey serving as a sort of gatekeeper of the Black Sea also pleases the US and other NATO members, who see Russia as the most significant and direct threat to Allies' security and peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. But let's not group the US and Turkey together just yet. Though Turkey has supplied Ukraine with weapons and supported its territorial integrity, it famously hasn't joined the sanctions against the Russian regime. It also famously blocked Sweden and Finland from joining NATO for quite some time to prevent the alliance from gaining a stronger foothold in the region and essentially encircling Russia. All things considered, it appears that Turkey still has no desire to burn all the bridges with Russia, maintaining a delicate, neither friend nor foe stance. But it's likely Turkey will continue blocking naval vessel transits through its straits in the Black Sea as long as it benefits the country, which, by all accounts, will be for quite a while. This blockade will likely force Russia to focus on land warfare against Ukraine. However, just like with the Black Sea Fleet's ships, the clock is ticking on Russia's reserve of land assets. Russia, a country with the highest number of tanks by a margin, is now seemingly running out of them at a concerning pace. According to some estimates, the Russian military has lost nearly 3,000 tanks since the beginning of the invasion. That's more tanks than most countries have to begin with. Sure, Russia started the war with over 12,000 units, but this increasingly fast loss rate is simply unsustainable, especially considering the challenges the country faces in replacing these losses.
To make matters worse, specific tank models are getting decimated in the war. For instance, there are reports that over 1,100 T-72 tanks, which spearhead Russia's armored assaults, have been destroyed since the beginning of the invasion. The same goes for the T-90, the most modern combat tank available to the Russian armed forces, whose number was reduced by over 100 in 2 short years. Dozens of other tanks have been damaged, abandoned, or captured, severely diminishing Russia's armored capabilities. However, these capabilities aren't only affected by the loss of tanks. Russia has also lost a host of armored fighting vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and artillery pieces. Though many figures are floating around, it's believed that the Russian military has lost at least 1,500 artillery pieces and over 6,000 armored vehicles. And that's just the documented losses. The total number of undocumented losses likely puts the figure to well above 10,000. Given that the Russian military complex can only produce about 600 new tanks and 1,000 new fighting vehicles every year under perfect conditions, it's clear that rebuilding its armored forces from the ashes of war will be no more possible than replenishing its naval fleet. There's another arguably more important resource that Russia is quickly running out of as well: troops. Russia's military death toll in Ukraine has passed the 50,000 mark as of April 2024. Now, you might be confused by this information given the fact Russia now has more soldiers than when the invasion first started, about 15% more at that. This anomaly has to do with the 300,000 civilians drafted in late 2022. Though the number might seem impressive, the truth is that these individuals were practically shoved to the front without proper training, basically sending them straight to their deaths. Russia seemingly has no choice but to perform such an atrocity, because by the time replacements could be properly trained and equipped, there would be virtually no one to replace. So Russia might have a higher number of soldiers, but it also has a significantly higher death toll with every passing day. According to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, this daily death toll is now between 800 and 1,000 soldiers. Crunch the numbers and you'll realize that Ukraine could take out over 200,000 Russian soldiers by the end of 2024, which would lead to permanent damage, if not the collapse of the Kremlin. Besides its diminishing ships, weapons, and troops, Russia has a whole host of issues to worry about. Lackluster leadership, corruption running rampant in the military, repeatedly wrong intel, international financial and military aid for Ukraine, the superiority of Ukraine's military tactics, NATO's actions. Wherever you look, there's seemingly another issue popping out. But if there's one thing the invasion of Ukraine should have taught us, it's that Russia is prepared to go to great lengths to prove a point. And let's face it, even with the diminishing military capabilities, Russia is still superior to Ukraine in almost every regard. Plus, many experts claim that Russia will never fully run out of military equipment. At best, the country won't have the capability to fully meet the demands of the war in the very near future. Worst case scenario, Russia will find a way to adapt and improve its military effectiveness, as it did many times before, and figuratively speaking, come back from the dead. Remember that the country has 4 more fleets: the Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, the Baltic Fleet, and the Caspian Flotilla at its disposal. The sheer existence of these fleets proves that the Russian Navy is far from beaten. If Turkey were to unblock Russian access to the Black Sea, the power balance in the naval theater of the Russo-Ukrainian war could shift in an instant. But what do you think? Is there any way for Russia to weasel out of the sticky situation it finds itself in? Or are you positive the country will indeed run out of military equipment at the pace it's currently going? Russians are turning against Putin. His so-called special military operation has become a humiliating mess. What was supposed to last 2 weeks has dragged on for over 2 years, with Putin failing at every turn. Now it's not just NATO-backed Ukraine he's struggling against. His own people are refusing to fight his wars. Let's break down how Putin's incompetence is driving his soldiers and citizens to revolt. We'll start with the most common major event that's possibly turned the tide of the entire war: Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. This is a significant shift in the war's tenuous dynamic between the two sides. For 30 months, Russia was the obvious aggressor, pushing further and deeper into Ukraine. Ukrainians were spread thin, trying to defend their lands and push the Russians back. While the first wave of attacks, the ones that managed to nearly make it into the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, were ultimately repelled by the end of 2022, that didn't stop Putin from maintaining his war rhetoric and strategy. Before the Kursk invasion, Putin's goals were simple: take as much of Ukraine as possible, and as fast as possible, and by any means necessary. And the rhetoric spouted by the Kremlin's news reports worked in Putin's favor. The citizens were assured that the Ukrainians were to blame for all the minute reasons behind the special military operation, and that the Russian army would soon quell them and return Russia to peace.
Of course, those reports only worked because of how Russia carefully managed to spin the narrative. Kremlin divided the Russian people into two groups: urbanites who lived in Moscow and other major cities far away from war and with nothing to fear, and the rural population, who was at the Kremlin's beck and call with multiple rounds of conscriptions and lucrative enlistment contracts, but we'll get around to those later. What the Kursk invasion changed is that Russia suddenly became the defender. Ukraine stepped over the boundary that divided the two countries and invaded one of Russia's regions, one that turned out to be woefully defended by Russian forces. The entire invasion seemed more like a fever dream than an actual military campaign. When it started, the Ukrainian government and its army was silent. There were no news reports to determine whether the invasion was successful and what exactly the goal of that strategy was in the first place. The first reports came from the Kremlin. They touted that the Ukrainian army crossed the border with a paltry 100 troops and a few military vehicles in what they thought was a desperate attempt to divert Russian forces from the real front, the ongoing fighting in the Ukrainian Donetsk region. The Russian authorities claimed that they would push back the Ukrainian invaders quickly and that the Russian forces stationed in Kursk were more than capable of doing so. A few days later, the reports from Russia became more dubious. The invasion seemed to not only have continued but progressed. Before long, Ukraine managed to take over control of dozens of villages and towns in the Kursk region. So what happened to elicit this change? The answer is rather simple: conscripts. Rather than using professional, contractually obligated soldiers to man the defensive positions in Kursk, the military was using fresh conscripts to fill those spots. The same was probably true for many other regions neighboring Ukraine, but Kursk was just the one where the effects were obvious. The conscripts in Kursk turned out to be no match for the invading Ukrainian forces, which over the first week of the invasion grew in number and obtained more artillery support. Over the few weeks of news coverage concerning the events in Kursk, there were more than a few videos showing Russian soldiers simply surrendering to the advancing Ukrainians. According to the report issued by the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, the Ukrainian army captured close to 600 Russian soldiers, who then became prisoners of war and were transported to Ukrainian prisons. In an early report from one of the prisons responsible for housing the POWs, it was suggested that roughly 80% of the soldiers in Kursk were conscripts. But why is that so terrible for the Russian army? Well, to answer that, we need to delve a bit deeper into how the Russian army functions, or more precisely, how Russia gets more soldiers. Unlike the US and many other countries around the world where enlisting in military service is entirely voluntary, the Russian army has a two-pronged enlistment process. First, there are contract soldiers, known as kontraktniki, who sign a 3-year contract in the Russian army, but then are generally encouraged to sign multiple, consecutive contracts to prolong their service. The second method is conscription. Before the Russo-Ukrainian War, every Russian male between 18 and 27 years of age was required to register with the Russian military. Out of that group, a specific number of registrants would be called to join the military every 6 months to serve as conscripts for 1 year. Originally, the mandatory military service period was 2 years, but was subsequently reduced, but we'll go over the reasoning for that a bit later. While Russia maintained a generally small population of conscripts, given that they were constantly replaced with fresh recruits, the war in Ukraine changed that significantly. Over the course of the war, it's estimated that the Russian military has been conscripting at a rate of roughly 130,000 soldiers every 6 months. In July 2023, the upper age limit for the draft was raised from 27 to 30, allowing Russia to pull from an even larger pool of Russian men to conscript into the army. As a result, Russia has been relying more and more on its stock of conscripts, rather than using contract soldiers. But where's the difference, you might ask? First, contract soldiers are paid for being in the military, and quite handsomely so. During the war, the Russian government has dangled contracts that pay out as much as 3 or 4 times the average salary. This has been particularly noticeable in the more rural regions of the country, which has resulted in the significantly lopsided demographics of the Russian military as of late. According to some sources, a Muscovite is over 50 times less likely to die in the war than a person belonging to a minority from Siberia. This trend shows that Russia is counting on people being desperate to earn a living wage and willing to sign up for 2 years of service in the military. Regardless, that doesn't quite solve the problem with conscription, since mandatory military service this way is largely unpaid. No, the major difference between contract soldiers and conscripts is in how they're treated in the army and the general structure of the Russian military. You see, unlike the US, which has 5 basic training locations for all recruits, the Russian military training is much more decentralized. Recruits are immediately assigned units, and each unit is responsible for conducting training according to the agreed-upon standards. However, this decentralization has led to many officers skirting the training regimes they enforce, creating a large variance in experience and training between each unit. Furthermore, since the conscripts are only meant to serve for 1 year, they typically don't receive the same amount or quality of training that the contract soldiers do. Usually, conscripts don't partake in many battle simulations, and their roles in the military are largely supportive, such as cleaning, cooking, or driving. If they're attached to squads, they typically have administrative or perfunctory roles, such as ceremonies or tending to military equipment. That's led to a somewhat disparaging view of conscripts throughout the Russian military, making them seem like the army's last resort and the bottom rung of the military. This is compounded by the fact that the Russian military legally can't deploy conscripts on missions abroad. Even if they were meant to be combat ready, their role in the army is to defend Russia against foreign attacks rather than lead the charge. What all this meant is that even at the height of the Russo-Ukrainian War, there was somewhat of an understanding that conscripts wouldn't be anywhere near the front lines, which is currently deep inside Ukrainian territory. But that all changed with the Kursk invasion. Suddenly, Ukraine became the attacker on Russian soil, and the conscripts were thrust into the heat of battle, as unprepared and under-equipped as they ever were. With all the previous points in mind, it's quite clear to see exactly why there has been a wave of surrenders in Kursk, and why the Russian military has failed to mount a significant defense in the region. With the floodgates to Russian territory open, Putin now has all the means and motive to actually send conscripts to defend Russia, and that's a particularly dangerous precedent, considering what happened to conscripts in previous campaigns. For that, we'll need to go back further into history, when the Soviet Union still existed. During Soviet times, the Russian army had several million conscripted soldiers, making it one of the largest conscripted armies in the world. Unlike today, these conscripts could be readily mobilized for any conflict. They ended up being deployed to fight in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. Known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, the war ended up being one of the final nails in the coffin for the Soviet Union, but not without significant casualties. By the time the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan, it was estimated to have lost 15,000 soldiers. While this number is insignificant compared to the casualties in the current war, the deaths of these mostly conscripted soldiers led to stern discontent with the Soviet regime and public institutions. The soldiers who survived the war were quickly forgotten amid the sweeping changes brought on by the fall of the Soviet Union, and sought to extend their military careers elsewhere. When Putin came to power, the Afghan veterans were brought back into the fold and awarded for their bravery and contribution to the country. Those same veterans became fervent supporters of Putin's regime, and perhaps a part of the reason the military was so ready to conduct offensive operations abroad. But for the average conscript, life would only get worse. After the war in Afghanistan came the first Chechen War in the mid-90s, leading to yet another estimated 10,000 deaths on the Russian side. As Russia considered Chechnya a Soviet republic and one close to reuniting with the Federation, it sent conscripts to fight in what would be a bloody civil war that led to as many as 100,000 civilian deaths, with 500,000 people displaced from the country. The protests against the regime began anew, and the public opinion on sending conscripts to war reached its lowest point. It was the war in Chechnya that ultimately caused the Russian Federation to sign the law preventing the deployment of conscripts abroad, yet the country still retained the draft. As a result, while Russia technically had compulsory military service, many families were trying their best to have young men avoid it as much as possible. Illnesses were invented and corroborated, and men were sent to higher education institutions. One of the ways to avoid the service was to be an active student. As Ian Garner, a historian focusing on Russian war history, explains, draft dodging is practically an art form in Russia. When the war between Russia and Ukraine escalated from a blitzkrieg to an attrition-based conflict, and Putin announced the first round of conscriptions, many Russians redoubled their efforts to avoid being called into service. As many as 900,000 people left the country by the end of 2022. Not all of them were service-capable men, but those men took their entire families and lives with them to get away from the Russian military. And now, with Ukraine in Russia's territory, the conscripts can again be called upon to the front lines, this time against an army that's much more experienced and determined to win. So it's no wonder that the scattered soldiers inside Kursk have been rapidly surrendering to incoming Ukrainians. They didn't really stand a chance. And if Ukraine decides to push its advantage,
The same thing can happen to other nearby regions, spreading discontent among both the soldiers and the civilian population about Putin's actions in the war. The Kursk incursion also showed that Putin doesn't mind if hundreds of people need to be displaced from their homes. As current estimates suggest, there were roughly 200,000 people in the Ukraine-occupied regions of Kursk. Throughout all that, Russia is still giving far more attention to contract soldiers. While conscripts can technically sign a contract, they can only do so after their first year of military service. Considering the scale of the Russo-Ukrainian war, this means that a lot of the conscripts might not even get to see the end of their first year of service. All the promises of glory, heroism, and monetary compensation are firmly directed toward the contract soldiers, who are on the front lines, fighting to gain a mile of land in Donetsk while being pelted by NATO-supplied ammunition. When the conscripts captured in Kursk were interviewed, most suggested they didn't expect to see actual combat. They were given minimal training and equipment in order to stand their ground. Some military bloggers even suggested that the newest batches have undergone only a week of military training. This is not nearly enough to prepare a person to function in the military, let alone be on the battlefield. According to Russian policies, conscripts should be trained for 1 to 2 months and then get an additional 3 to 6 months of training to be considered ready to serve. In the US, the initial boot camp lasts 10 weeks and is followed by at least 22 weeks of advanced training. Compared to that, a week or two is practically nothing. The Kremlin is aware of the discrepancy in how it treats conscripts and contractnikis, and has so far worked to get ahead of any damning reports to cover them up. While the Ukrainians were sweeping through the farmlands of Kursk with Russian conscripts surrendering in their wake, the officers were celebrating the official Officers' Day. The reports from the Kursk region still show a lack of proper military response from Russia. Zelensky has noted that Ukraine intends to keep the region occupied for as long as possible, giving it another chip to put on the negotiating table. In the meantime, Putin has been trying, and failing, to sweep the very existence of the Kursk invasion under the rug. But conscripts are not the only group Putin needs to be worried about. Some people much closer to Moscow, who can pull significant strings, have also started to doubt the Russian president's capability to lead the country. We're talking about the Russian oligarchs. These men and women, but mostly men, mainly got rich by Russia's prodigious expanse in the energy sector, particularly the oil and gas industries. The old oligarchs got their wealth in the 90s, when the government reforms caused significant industry changes, allowing the few to get rich off the switch from socialism to capitalism in what would be modern Russia. Putin largely tried to replace the old oligarchs, who criticized him when he came to power, albeit not as successfully. After a few were imprisoned, the remainder struck a deal with Putin to lose a part of their wealth and power, but remain in the Russian president's good graces and continue to benefit. But this only worked so long as the country's energy sector kept prospering. The Kremlin needed the oligarchs, who have developed extensive ties with prominent Western companies, as much as the oligarchs needed Putin, who could bail out failing companies via the state bank. The war in Ukraine turned the situation on its head. Practically overnight, Russia had lost some of its largest trading partners and had to scramble to sign trade deals with China and India to make up for the losses. The deals with China were arguably much less lucrative than those with Europe, but they were practically the only way to keep the country running during wartime. During 2023, the trade with China reached its peak at $240 billion and is now showing a slight decline. At the beginning of the war, when it was still uncertain how long it would take, the oligarchs remained silent on the matter, still looking to see the economic implications of the invasion. But when the first signs of trouble started, some chose to make a more public stance against the war. One such oligarch is Oleg Tinkov, who renounced his Russian citizenship in 2022 and called the Russian supporters morons. Tinkov is likely the first in many dominoes to crumble around Putin. Other oligarchs merely resorted to token criticism and grumbling, such as Mikhail Fridman, who co-founded Russia's largest private bank. Fridman returned to Russia when the conflict between Israel and Hamas broke out, showing that Putin still holds some reins in how oligarchs can operate. Putin has used the war as an opportunity to further curb the influence the oligarchs have on his regime. One example is the recent lawsuit to nationalize a company owned by one of Russia's richest men, Andrei Melnichenko. With Russia under extensive sanctions from the West, many companies owned by oligarchs such as Melnichenko no longer have the same economic connections they had before the war. It makes them surprisingly easy pickings for the Russian state to control them and people who own them as a result. But the oligarchs are probably in on the scheme as well. Remember when we discussed that many of them got rich in the energy sector? Well, that sector is not looking so good right now. Repeated Ukrainian strikes on key refineries have caused widespread deficits in refined oil and gas. This is primarily due to Russia using the just-in-time delivery approach, keeping very little oil in reserve, despite being one of the world's largest producers of it. This means that a sudden drop in production, such as a refinery in Western Russia being bombed to oblivion, can disrupt the flow of these precious resources.
This affects both trade and the internal economy. In fact, Russia has lost nearly 15% of its oil refining capacity over the previous year, which has ultimately caused the government to stop exporting fuel to all but 4 former Soviet countries until the end of 2024, with some analysts suggesting that the ban will persist through 2025. Additionally, Russia has asked Kazakhstan to create a reserve of 100,000 tons of gasoline that can be supplied to Russia on short notice. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Russian oligarchs have really lost much throughout the war. Bloomberg published a list of a dozen companies that collectively gained more than $11 billion in 2023 alone through dividend payments, so the money still kept flowing into the oligarchs' pockets, even if there was a little bit less of it from other sources. However, Putin's attempts to dismantle some of the biggest earners and the fact that the oil and gas trade is starting to directly get hit by Ukrainian attacks create a dangerous precedent for the oligarchs who operate in the sector. As the energy sector is responsible for roughly 20% of the country's GDP, consistent trade deal cancellations and export bans are bound to create long-term deficits. Western sanctions also limit how much coverage the oligarchs have under Putin. With the connections they fostered severed by sanctions, Putin may find the old stock of oligarchs useless in maintaining the facade of universal support in the country. To make matters worse for Putin, Ukraine has started to ramp up its offensive, which can further alienate oligarchs and the middle class alike. On September 10, 2024, Ukraine launched its biggest and most ambitious drone strike yet. Over 140 drones were deployed to strike deep into Russian territory. The attack is the second of its kind, following the earlier August 21st strike, with 45 drones. The main target, Moscow itself. While the initial strike in August was fully intercepted by Russian anti-air defenses, the September strike killed at least one person and wrecked dozens of homes in the urban center of Russia. The ensuing chaos diverted 50 flights coming into Moscow. This is the first instance of Ukraine hitting the Russian capital and is likely a portent of attacks to come. With these drone strikes, Ukraine has sent a clear message to Putin: Russia is no longer safe. The attacks can resonate deeply within the Moscow communities, which have so far been largely unaffected by the war itself. When combined with Ukraine managing to get hold of more Russian territory in a month than Russia's offensive has done over the previous 7, the attack set a dangerous precedent for Putin. The Kremlin might no longer be able to sweep the truth about the war under the rug. And if the conscription issues continue, Russia may need to tap into a resource it hasn't used in a while: the middle and upper classes of large cities. Somewhat surprisingly, this presents yet another attack on Russian oligarchs. While they could stand to watch the action unfold from the sidelines and rake in the money, the wealthy Russians are now truly in a pinch. Their companies are under threat of being seized by the government, their cash flows are being squeezed by the export bans, and their children might be called upon to die for Putin's fragile ego. Even the newer wave of Russia's elite is starting to feel the pain. Since the energy sector has been booming for a while, it's caused a chain reaction of other sectors falling behind. China has swept in to take the reins and create near monopolies for consumer goods ranging from smartphones to cars to agricultural equipment. With domestic manufacturing under attack, there's little reason to stay in business if it's cheaper to buy from abroad. As such, Putin is on a collision course with the very same people who have supported his stranglehold on Russian politics. If he decides to make an overtly aggressive move, the oligarchs might become desperate enough to remove him from the seat permanently. Ultimately, Putin is on the verge of losing support from practically all of Russia's citizens, at least the ones who can directly impact the war in Ukraine. If one of those dominoes starts falling, Putin will likely have to double down on the war in Ukraine to close it out before it's too late. On paper, Russia still has the resources to outlast Ukraine in a war of attrition. After all, despite accruing nearly 700,000 troop casualties over the past 30 months, Ukraine has lost nearly 500,000 soldiers itself, and Russia has twice the population to throw at the meat grinder. However, Ukraine's moving into Russian territory has renewed Western support, with the US announcing more aid packages before the end of the year. Additionally, despite long-standing saber-rattling, Russia's threats of deploying nuclear weapons against NATO have turned out to be empty so far. The alliance can be emboldened to send more advanced military equipment to Ukraine, some of which were blocked by the very same nuclear threats. The first batch of 65 F-16 fighter jets has already taken flight in the skies above Ukraine, and Zelensky now might have just enough leverage to ask for more. If Putin doesn't end the war soon, someone else will end the war for him, and it's unlikely to be in his favor. But what do you think? How long will the war continue, and will Putin remain Russia's president afterward?